A woman steps off a train into darkness, her future promised in letters that never came true. A widower guards his broken heart behind silence. A little girl hasn't spoken since her mother died, until the moment a stranger tries to leave. Please don't let us be alone again. 5 words that will shatter 3 lives and rebuild them into something neither loneliness nor loss can destroy. This is the story of a homestead at the edge of nowhere, where the summer heat burns everything except the truth. Sometimes the family you need finds you in the dust, the dark, and the desperate choice to stay. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. The train lurched to a stop with a metallic shriek that cut through the Nevada night like a blade through silk. Lydia Hale pressed her gloved hand against the window, peering through the smudged glass into a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the stars themselves. The depot, if one could call it that, was little more than a weathered platform, and a single building with half its shutters hanging loose, swaying slightly in the hot wind that carried the scent of sagebrush, and something older, something that tasted like disappointment. She was the only passenger to disembark. The conductor, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth, helped her down with her 2 worn carpet bags and a trunk that contained everything she owned in the world. "You sure about this, miss?" he asked, his voice rough with concern that came too late to matter. "Ain't much out here. Town's practically empty these days. Silver dried up 2 years back." "I'm expected," Lydia said, though her voice trembled with less conviction than she'd intended. She straightened her traveling dress, a faded blue cotton that had once been fine, but now bore the unmistakable marks of a life coming undone at the seams. "Mr. Patterson should be here." The conductor glanced around the empty platform, then back at her with eyes that held too much knowledge of broken promises. "Well, I hope so, miss. I surely do." He tipped his hat and climbed back aboard. Within minutes, the train was pulling away, its whistle mournful in the vast emptiness, leaving Lydia standing alone with her luggage and the growing certainty that something had gone terribly wrong. The station building was dark, its door locked. A handwritten sign tacked to the wood read, "Closed. No agent on duty." Lydia's heart, already tight with anxiety, constricted further. She'd traveled for 6 days from Philadelphia, each mile taking her farther from everything familiar, drawn by letters written in careful script that promised partnership, respectability, a chance to start again after the scandal that had destroyed her reputation and left her with nowhere else to turn. "Dear Miss Hale, I am a merchant of good standing in Carson Springs, Nevada territory. I seek a woman of quality to be my wife. I can offer you a comfortable home, security, and the respect of our community. If you're willing to venture west, I believe we could build a prosperous life together. Yours in anticipation, Gerald Patterson." She'd written back immediately. What choice did she have? At 26, with her father dead and her brother's wife making it clear she was no longer welcome in their Philadelphia home, the advertisement page had become her only Bible. Gerald Patterson's letters had arrived monthly, each one more encouraging than the last, until finally he'd sent money for the train fare and instructions to arrive on this date, at the station where he would be waiting. But he wasn't. Lydia sat on her trunk and waited as the night deepened and the heat that had been unbearable during the day settled into something merely oppressive. Cicadas sang their rhythmic chorus in the darkness beyond the platform. Once she heard footsteps and stood hopefully, but it was only a drunk stumbling past, muttering to himself. He didn't even glance her direction. By midnight, she accepted what her gut had been telling her for hours. Gerald Patterson wasn't coming. Perhaps he'd never intended to come. Perhaps he'd found someone else. Or perhaps, and this thought made her stomach turn, the letters themselves had been some kind of cruel game, a way for a lonely man to feel connected to something without ever having to risk anything real. She couldn't stay at the station. That much was clear. The drunk had frightened her, and there was no telling who else might wander past a woman alone with luggage that marked her as an outsider, possibly with money. Carson Springs, what she could see of it, consisted of perhaps 20 buildings, half of them clearly abandoned, their windows dark as dead eyes. The hotel she'd spotted from the train had looked marginally operational, but she'd counted her remaining money 3 times during the journey and knew she had perhaps enough for 2 nights' lodging and a few meals. Then nothing. Nothing. The word echoed in her mind like a death knell. She'd burned every bridge to come here, trusted every promise in those letters. And now she was stranded in a dying town in the middle of the Nevada desert with no one expecting her, no one to help her, and nowhere to go. Lydia stood, her legs stiff from sitting, and looked past the town toward the dark expanse of prairie beyond. That's when she saw it, a small point of light, distant and wavering, like a candle flame viewed through water. A lantern, perhaps. It seemed to hover at the very edge of where civilization gave up and wilderness began. She shouldn't have been drawn to it. Every practical instinct she possessed screamed that walking into the desert darkness toward an unknown light was the act of a desperate woman with no sense of self-preservation. But desperation, Lydia was discovering, had a way of drowning out practical instincts. The light suggested life, habitation, possibly someone who might help her, or at least tell her what had become of Gerald Patterson. She couldn't carry everything. After a moment's hesitation, she hid her trunk behind the station building, covering it with some old canvas she found discarded nearby. She took one carpet bag with her most essential possessions, a change of clothes, her mother's Bible, the letters from Patterson, and the small amount of money she had left sewn into the lining. The walk was longer than it looked. Distance played tricks in the clear desert air, and the light that had seemed a 10-minute stroll away remained stubbornly distant as Lydia walked, stumbled, really, through the darkness. The heat radiating from the ground made the air shimmer even at night, and her dress clung to her back with sweat. She'd been traveling for nearly a week, sleeping in train seats, eating sporadically, and the accumulated exhaustion was beginning to make her dizzy. Twice she nearly turned back, but each time the light flickered ahead like a promise, and she kept going. It must have been nearly 1 a.m. when she finally reached the source, a small homestead consisting of a single-story house with a sagging porch, a barn that leaned slightly to one side, and a few other outbuildings she couldn't make out clearly in the darkness. The lantern hung from a post near the house, attracting moths that spiraled around it in their ancient, doomed dance. Lydia stood at the edge of the property, suddenly uncertain. What was she doing? She couldn't just knock on a stranger's door in the middle of the night and expect, what, charity? Rescue? The man who lived here probably had a shotgun and no patience for unexpected visitors. She should leave. Come back in daylight, perhaps. Or better yet, return to town and figure out some other solution. But even as she thought it, her legs gave way. The world tilted sideways and she found herself on her knees in the dust, her carpet bag falling beside her. The heat, the hunger, the fear, the exhaustion of the past week, it all crashed over her at once, and she couldn't find the strength to stand back up. "Help!" she tried to call out, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Please, I need—" The door to the house opened, and a man's silhouette appeared, backlit by lamplight from within. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and he held what might have been a rifle. "Who's there?" His voice was hard, suspicious. "This is private property. State your business or move on." Lydia tried to answer, tried to stand, but her body refused to cooperate. The world was spinning now, the lantern light splitting into multiple flames that danced and merged. She heard footsteps approaching, rapid now, and then the man was crouching beside her, his hand on her shoulder. Ma'am, are you hurt?" The hardness in his voice had shifted to concern, reluctant but real. Up close, she could see his face, weathered, probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that looked like they'd forgotten how to trust anything. "What are you doing out here?" "The train," Lydia managed. Someone was supposed to meet me, but no one came." The words were tumbling out disconnected, her mind struggling to organize them properly. "I saw your light. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I just didn't know where else." "You walked from town? At night?" He sounded incredulous. "That's near 3 miles across open ground. Lord." He caught himself, clearly torn between irritation and something that might have been pity. "Can you stand?" "I don't think so. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Tears were threatening now, which made everything worse. Lydia Hale did not cry, had not cried since her father's funeral, and certainly wasn't going to start now in front of a strange man in the middle of nowhere. But her body seemed to have other ideas. The man stood, clearly wrestling with some internal debate. "Stay here," he finally said, and disappeared back into the house. Lydia heard voices inside, his and another, higher, younger, a child's voice. When he returned, he was carrying a blanket. The house ain't appropriate for a strange woman at night. My daughter's inside, and I won't have gossip. But the barn's got clean hay, and it's at least shelter. You can stay there until morning, then you'll need to move on. I don't take in strays. The word should have stung, but Lydia was too exhausted to feel anything but relief. Thank you, she whispered. Just until morning, I promise. He helped her up, his hands surprisingly gentle despite the roughness in his voice, and half carried her to the barn. The interior smelled of hay and horses, clean and somehow comforting. He led her to a corner where the hay was piled thick and spread the blanket over it. There's water in the bucket there. It's for the animals, but it's fresh. Help yourself. Thank you, mister. Crowell. Thomas Crowell. He hesitated, then added, Don't thank me yet. Come morning, you'll need to head back to town and find proper arrangements. I've got enough troubles without adding a stranger to the mix. Of course. I understand. Lydia sank onto the hay, and it felt like the most comfortable bed she'd ever known. I'm Lydia Hale. And I truly am grateful, Mr. Crowell, whatever you might think. He grunted something that might have been acknowledgement and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. What brought you out here? To Nevada, I mean, if you don't mind my asking. I was supposed to marry a man named Gerald Patterson. He advertised for a wife, wrote me letters, sent money for the journey. She laughed, a hollow sound. Except he wasn't at the station like he promised. No one knew where to find him. And here I am. Thomas's face darkened. Patterson? Gerald Patterson? Hope flared in Lydia's chest. You know him? I know of him. Thomas's voice had gone cold. He left Carson Springs 4 months ago, owed money all over town and cleared out in the night. Some say he headed to California, others to Denver. Either way, he's long gone. The words landed like physical blows. 4 months. The letters had been coming regularly until just 6 weeks ago. Had they all been lies? Had Patterson been planning his departure even as he wrote to her about their future together? I see, Lydia said softly, though she saw nothing except the ruins of the last hope she'd been clinging to. I'm sorry, Thomas said, and this time his voice held genuine sympathy. That's a hard thing. But come morning, you'll want to see if the station agent can help you arrange return passage. Carson Springs ain't got much to offer a woman alone. He left before she could respond, pulling the barn door shut behind him and leaving her in darkness broken only by the thin lines of moonlight between the boards. Lydia lay back on the hay, staring up at shadows, and finally let herself feel the full weight of her situation. She was 26 years old, alone in the Nevada desert, with no money for return passage, no family who would take her back, and no prospects of any kind. She'd gambled everything on the promises of a man who'd apparently been a fraud from the beginning. The scandal that had driven her from Philadelphia, her foolish trust in a cousin's husband who'd claimed to care for her and then blamed her when his wife discovered their correspondence, had marked her as damaged goods. No respectable household would hire her, no decent man would court her. And now this. Lydia closed her eyes, but sleep was elusive despite her exhaustion. The hay rustled beneath her with every breath, and somewhere in the rafters above an owl hooted softly, hunting. She thought of the light that had drawn her here, that small flame in the vast darkness, and wondered if it had been a beacon or a trap. Outside, the cicadas sang on, and the heat pressed down like a hand on her chest, and Lydia Hale lay in a stranger's barn wondering if morning would bring any answers at all, or just more questions she couldn't bear to face. She must have slept eventually, because when she opened her eyes again, thin gray light was seeping through the barn boards, and she could hear movement from the direction of the house. A rooster crowed, and chickens clucked and scratched somewhere nearby. The normal sounds of a homestead waking, utterly mundane, except for the fact that she was lying in a barn belonging to a man she'd met in the dark, while fleeing from a future that had evaporated before it even began. Lydia sat up carefully, her body protesting every movement. She was sore, dusty, and probably looked like something that had crawled out of the desert, which, in a way, she supposed she was. She ran her fingers through her hair, trying to restore some order, and brushed the hay from her dress as best she could. The bucket of water Thomas had mentioned sat nearby. Lydia dipped her hands in, washing her face and the back of her neck, then drank deeply. The water was cool and clean, and it helped clear her head a little. She needed to think, to plan, but all she could focus on was the immediate necessity of not becoming more of a burden to Thomas Crowell than she already was. She would leave quietly. That was the plan. Gather her things, slip out before he had to come tell her to go, and walk back to Carson Springs. From there, she'd figure something out. She always had. The past year had taught her that survival was largely a matter of taking one small step forward when the alternative was standing still and drowning. Lydia picked up her carpet bag and moved toward the barn door, trying to be as silent as possible. The chickens outside seemed to sense movement and increase their volume, which made her wince. Through the gap in the door, she could see the house, its windows now glowing with lamplight. The homestead looked different in the early morning, still worn and weathered, but somehow less desperate than it had seemed in the darkness. Someone had tried to keep it up, she could see that. The fences were mended, even if they were made from mismatched wood. The yard was swept. It was the maintenance of someone trying to hold on, to keep things together with whatever resources they had. She pushed the door open carefully and stepped out into the morning. The air was already warm, promising another scorching day. The sky was that pale, washed-out blue that seemed endless, and the prairie stretched away in all directions, dotted with sagebrush and the occasional stunted tree. It was beautiful in its stark way, she supposed, though it was also terrifying in its emptiness. "You're up early." Lydia jumped, her hand flying to her chest. Thomas Crowell stood near the house, holding a bucket of water. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly. He was younger than she'd initially thought, probably no more than 35, but his face had the deeply carved lines of someone who'd weathered hard times. His clothes were patched but clean, and his dark eyes watched her with an expression somewhere between wariness and resignation. "I was just leaving," Lydia said quickly. "I didn't want to trouble you further. Thank you again for the shelter last night, Mr. Crowell. It was extraordinarily kind, and I—" "Have you eaten?" he interrupted. The question caught her off guard. "No, but I don't expect—" "Can't send a woman off into the heat without breakfast." He said it grudgingly, as if the words were being pulled from him against his will. "It ain't much, but there's coffee and some bread. You should eat something before you walk back." Lydia wanted to refuse on principle, to maintain what little dignity she had left, but her stomach betrayed her with an audible growl. She couldn't remember the last proper meal she'd had. "That's very generous," she said softly. "If you're certain it's not an imposition." Thomas grunted. It seemed to be his primary form of communication, and gestured toward the house. "Come on then, but just breakfast. I meant what I said last night. I can't take on responsibilities that ain't mine." "I understand completely. Just breakfast, then I'll go." She followed him to the house, acutely aware of how disheveled she must look. The porch boards creaked under their feet, and Thomas held the door open, standing aside to let her enter first. The interior was dim after the bright morning light, but as her eyes adjusted, Lydia took in a single large room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space combined. A small fireplace stood cold now, in summer, and a cast-iron stove radiated heat from the breakfast cooking. The furniture was simple but well-made. A table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair by the window, a few shelves holding books and dishes. And sitting at the table, watching Lydia with enormous dark eyes, was the child she'd heard last night. The little girl couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. She had her father's dark hair, worn in 2 braids, and she was wearing a faded calico dress that had been carefully patched at the hem. But it was her expression that struck Lydia most. An overwhelming sadness that no child should carry, paired with an intensity of focus that suggested she was trying to understand everything about Lydia in a single glance. "Elsie," Thomas said quietly, "this is Miss Hale. She'll be joining us for breakfast, then heading back to town. Miss Hale, this is my daughter, Elsie." "Hello, Elsie," Lydia said gently, offering what she hoped was a warm smile. "It's lovely to meet you." The child didn't respond, didn't even nod. She just continued staring with those dark, bottomless eyes. After a moment, she looked down at her plate, which held a piece of bread torn into small pieces, but otherwise untouched. "Elsie don't talk much," Thomas said, his voice carrying an undercurrent of pain. "Don't take it personal." "Of course not," Lydia murmured, though her heart ached at the sight of the silent child. She'd seen that kind of grief before. that retreating into silence when the world became too much to bear. Thomas gestured to a chair. Sit. I'll pour the coffee. Breakfast was simple. Black coffee, thick slices of bread that was a day or two old but still edible, and a small pot of preserves that looked homemade. Thomas ate mechanically, his focus primarily on his daughter, encouraging her to eat with quiet words that Elsie ignored. The child picked at her bread, rearranging the pieces, but Lydia noticed that very little actually made it to her mouth. "How long have you lived here, Mr. Crowell?" Lydia asked, trying to fill the uncomfortable silence. 4 years, came out from Missouri, thought I'd try my hand at farming. His laugh was bitter. Turned out the land's better at growing rocks than crops, but we manage. I do some work in town when it's available, odd jobs, repairs. It's enough to get by. It's a beautiful place, Lydia offered, though she wasn't sure beautiful was the right word. Austere, perhaps. Unforgiving. It's isolated, Thomas corrected, but that has its advantages. No one bothers us out here. The implication was clear. He preferred it that way. No one bothering him meant no one helping him either. No one to notice when a little girl stopped talking or eating properly. Lydia wondered briefly what had happened to Elsie's mother, but knew better than to ask. The answer was written in Thomas's grief-hardened face and his daughter's silence. They ate without further conversation, and Lydia forced herself to finish every bite despite the bread sitting heavy in her nervous stomach. She'd need the energy for the walk back, and who knew when she'd eat again. When she'd drained the last of her coffee, Lydia stood. "Thank you again, Mr. Crowell, for everything. I'll get my bag from the barn and be on my way." Thomas nodded, already rising to clear the dishes. Elsie remained at this table, her bread still mostly untouched, watching Lydia with that same intense, unreadable gaze. Lydia smiled at the child. "Goodbye, Elsie. It was nice meeting you, even if it was brief." The little girl's expression flickered, something that might have been sadness or maybe just curiosity, but still she said nothing. Outside, Lydia retrieved her carpet bag from the barn and stood for a moment, looking back at the small homestead. In the morning light, it seemed even more remote, perched at the edge of civilization like a ship anchored in a vast sea. She thought of Thomas and Elsie, alone out here, each locked in their own private grief, and felt a pang of something that might have been kinship. She understood loneliness, understood the way loss could hollow you out and leave you going through the motions of living without quite remembering how to feel alive. But it wasn't her place to do anything about it. She was a stranger passing through, and Thomas Crowell had made it abundantly clear that he didn't want or need her help. Lydia adjusted her grip on the carpet bag and turned toward town, squinting against the sun that was already climbing higher, already turning the day hot and harsh. She'd taken perhaps 10 steps when she heard it. The creak of the door, then running footsteps, light and quick across the packed dirt. She turned just in time to see Elsie racing toward her, barefoot, her braids flying. The child's face was desperate, terrified, and before Lydia could react, Elsie had grabbed her hand with both of her own small ones, holding on with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "Please," Elsie whispered, and the sound of her voice, thin, fragile, barely audible, cut through the morning like a cry. "Please don't let us be alone again." The world seemed to stop in that moment. Lydia stood frozen, staring down at the small hands clutching hers, at the desperate face of a child who had just spoken her first words in what must have been months. Behind Elsie, Thomas had emerged from the house and now stood on the porch, his face gone white with shock, one hand braced against the doorframe as if he needed it to stay upright. "Elsie?" His voice cracked on the name. "Elsie, did you just—" But the little girl wasn't looking at her father. Her entire focus was on Lydia, those dark eyes brimming with tears that hadn't yet fallen, her small body trembling with the effort of whatever courage it had taken to speak after so much silence. "Please," she whispered again, and this time the word broke in the middle. Lydia's carpet bag slipped from her fingers and hit the dust. She knelt slowly, bringing herself to Elsie's eye level, and gently placed her free hand over the two small ones still gripping her so tightly. "I'm here," she said softly. "I'm right here, sweetheart." Thomas crossed the yard in 3 long strides, but when he reached them, he seemed uncertain what to do, his hands hovering near his daughter, but not quite touching her, as if he feared she might shatter. "Elsie, baby, you talked. You said words." His voice was thick with emotion, wonder and pain mixing together. Can you say more? Elsie shook her head mutely, and Lydia could feel the child's grip tightening, her small body pressing closer as if seeking protection. From what, Lydia couldn't say. Certainly not from Thomas, who was looking at his daughter with such raw hope it was almost painful to witness. "Mr. Crowell," Lydia said quietly, keeping her voice steady despite the chaos of feelings swirling through her. "Perhaps we should all go back inside. It's getting hot out here." He nodded slowly, seeming grateful for the suggestion, for someone else making a decision when his own mind was clearly reeling. Yes. Elsie didn't release Lydia's hand as they walked back to the house, and Lydia didn't try to pull away. Inside, the air was only marginally cooler, but at least they were out of the direct sun that was already beating down with relentless intensity. Thomas pulled out a chair at the table, and Lydia sat, Elsie immediately climbing into her lap and curling against her chest like a much younger child seeking comfort. Thomas sat across from them, his hands flat on the table, staring at his daughter as if she were something miraculous and terrifying all at once. "She hasn't spoken in 8 months," he said hoarsely. Not since her mother died." The words hung in the air, heavy with grief. Lydia stroked Elsie's hair gently, feeling the child's rapid heartbeat against her own. "I'm so sorry," she murmured. "That must have been incredibly difficult for both of you." "Difficult." Thomas laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "That's one word for it. The doctor said it was shock, grief, said she'd talk again when she was ready, that I shouldn't force it. But 8 months and not a word. I'd started to think—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice whatever fear had been growing in him all these silent months. "Children heal in their own time," Lydia said, though she felt painfully unqualified to offer comfort. What did she know about children, about loss on this scale? Her own losses had been different, scandal and social death rather than the physical death of a parent, but perhaps all grief spoke the same language in the end. "Why you?" Thomas asked suddenly, and there was no accusation in the question, only genuine confusion. "She doesn't warm to strangers. Hell, she barely tolerates the few neighbors who still check on us. What made you different?" Lydia looked down at Elsie, at the dark head tucked under her chin, and realized she didn't have an answer. "I don't know," she admitted. "Perhaps because I'm leaving? Perhaps it's easier to reach out to someone who isn't staying, someone who can't—" She stopped herself, aware that she was treading into dangerous territory. "Someone who can't disappoint her by staying and then dying anyway?" Thomas finished, his voice bitter. "Yeah, that thought's occurred to me too." They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound Elsie's quiet breathing and the ticking of a clock somewhere in the room. Outside, the chickens continued their morning routine, oblivious to the small miracle that had just occurred, and the heat continued its steady climb toward unbearable. "You can't leave now," Thomas said finally, and it sounded like the words were being torn from somewhere deep inside him. "I know what I said before, know I made it clear you couldn't stay, but—" He gestured helplessly at his daughter, still clinging to Lydia like a lifeline. "Look at her. She spoke because of you. If you leave now after she just found her voice again, I don't know what it'll do to her. Mr. Crowell, I appreciate the impossible position this creates, but I can't just— I'll pay you." The words came out fast, desperate. "I don't have much, but I can pay you something. You could help with Elsie, with the house, just for a while, just until she's more stable. Please." Lydia's mind raced. A job, even a temporary one, would solve her immediate problem of having nowhere to go and no money. But working in a man's home, living under his roof, would raise questions she wasn't sure either of them could answer satisfactorily. "People would talk," she said carefully. "A single woman living with a widower. It wouldn't look proper. The nearest neighbor is 4 miles away, and they mind their own business. The town's too busy dying to care about gossip." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I'm not asking for propriety, Miss Hale. I'm asking for my daughter's life back." Put that way, how could she refuse? And truthfully, where else did she have to go? Back to Philadelphia, to a family that had made clear she was an embarrassment? To another town, another attempt at finding work while carrying the stain of scandal? At least here, in this remote corner of nowhere, no one knew her story. No one knew what she'd fled from. Just until she's speaking more regularly, Lydia said, hearing herself agree, even as part of her screamed that this was another mistake, another promise that would end badly. A few weeks, perhaps, until you're both more settled. The relief on Thomas's face was immediate and profound. Thank you. Thank you, Miss Hale. I know it's asking a lot. I know I have no right, but thank you. Elsie stirred in Lydia's lap, pulling back just enough to look up at her face. The child's eyes held a question, and Lydia found herself smiling despite everything. I'm going to stay for a little while, sweetheart. Would that be all right with you? Elsie didn't answer with words, but she nodded once, firmly, and that small gesture felt like a contract being signed, a promise being made that Lydia wasn't entirely sure she could keep. The rest of that first day passed in a strange blur of domestic activity. Thomas showed Lydia the small room off the main living space that had belonged to Elsie's mother, now shrouded in dust and grief. The bed was made, but the covers looked undisturbed for months. A few dresses still hung on pegs on the wall, and a hairbrush sat on a small table, strands of brown hair still caught in its bristles. I couldn't bring myself to clear it out, Thomas said from the doorway, not entering. Seemed wrong somehow, but you can use it, change whatever you need to. His voice caught. She'd want someone to get use out of it. Lydia touched the quilt on the bed, feeling the careful stitching, the hours of work someone had put into making this room a home. What was her name? She asked gently. Sarah Crowell. Thomas's hands clenched at his sides. She was strong, Miss Hale, stronger than me in most ways. But the fever came on so fast, and by the time I got the doctor out here, there was nothing anyone could do. She died in that bed, with Elsie sitting right outside the door, listening to everything. Horror washed through Lydia. Elsie heard her mother die? I didn't know she was there until it was too late. I told her to stay in the barn to wait for me there, but she must have snuck back to the house. Thomas's face was haggard with remembered anguish. When I came out to tell her, she was just sitting against the wall, staring at nothing, and she hasn't spoken since. Not until this morning. I'm so sorry, Lydia whispered, inadequate words for such tremendous pain. She wanted to say more, to offer some comfort, but what comfort existed for a loss like that? Thomas nodded stiffly. I'll leave you to settle in. Elsie's probably in her room. She spends most of her time in there, drawing pictures. She used to draw flowers and birds. Happy things. Now she just draws the same thing over and over. He didn't elaborate on what that thing was, and Lydia didn't ask. Once Thomas had gone back outside to tend to his chores, Lydia sat on Sarah Crowell's bed and let herself process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. She'd arrived expecting a husband, a new life, and found instead abandonment and betrayal. She'd sought shelter from a stranger and ended up entangled in a grief so profound it had stolen a child's voice. And now she was living in a dead woman's room, wearing a dead woman's apron that Thomas had silently handed her, trying to figure out how to help people she didn't know and hadn't asked to save. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it weren't so desperately sad. A soft knock on the doorframe made her look up. Elsie stood there holding a piece of paper and a stub of charcoal. She held them out wordlessly, and Lydia took them, looking down at the drawing. It showed a house, simple and square, with 3 stick figures standing in front of it, 2 tall ones and 1 small one in the middle, holding both their hands. Is this us? Lydia asked gently. You and your father and me? Elsie nodded, then pointed at the paper, then at Lydia, then at herself. The meaning was clear enough. This is what I want. This is what I hope for. Lydia's throat tightened. I'm only staying for a little while, Elsie. You understand that, don't you? Just until you're feeling better. But Elsie shook her head stubbornly and pointed again at the drawing, at the 3 figures standing together. Then she took Lydia's hand and tugged gently, leading her out of Sarah's room and into her own small space. Elsie's room was tiny, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a small chest, but every surface was covered with drawings. They were pinned to the walls, stacked on the chest, scattered across the bed. And Thomas had been right. They were all the same. Every single one showed a woman lying down, her eyes closed, surrounded by darkness. Sometimes there were tears falling from the woman's face. Sometimes there were flowers scattered around her, but always the same image, drawn over and over and over again by a child trying to process the unprocessable. "Oh, sweetheart," Lydia breathed, understanding flooding through her. This was how Elsie had been speaking, the only way she knew how. Through these pictures, she'd been screaming the words she couldn't voice. "I saw her. I remember. I can't forget." Elsie watched Lydia's face anxiously, as if worried she'd be scolded for the drawings. Instead, Lydia knelt and pulled the child into a tight embrace. "It's all right to miss her," she said softly. "It's all right to feel sad, and it's all right to draw these pictures if they help. Your mother loved you so much, Elsie. I can tell just from being in her room, from seeing how carefully she made everything. That love doesn't go away just because she did." Elsie clung to her, and Lydia felt dampness on her shoulder, tears finally, after 8 months of silence. They stood there together, Lydia holding this child she barely knew, while outside the heat pressed down and the day stretched ahead with all its uncertainties. When Elsie finally pulled back, her eyes were red but somehow clearer, as if crying had washed away some of the fog that had been surrounding her. She picked up a fresh piece of paper and her charcoal and began to draw. This time she drew a woman standing up, her eyes open, with the sun overhead. It was crude, as all children's drawings were, but the difference was stark. This woman was alive. "That's beautiful," Lydia said truthfully. "Should we show your father?" Elsie hesitated, then nodded. Together, they went outside where Thomas was mending a section of fence that had come loose. He looked up as they approached, wariness and hope warring on his face. "Papa," Elsie said, so quietly Lydia almost didn't hear it. "Look." Thomas dropped the hammer he'd been holding. It hit the ground with a dull thud. "Elsie? You called me Papa?" Elsie nodded and held up the drawing. Thomas took it with shaking hands, staring at the simple picture as if it contained all the secrets of the universe. "You drew something different," he said, his voice rough. "Something happy." "Miss Lydia said it's okay to miss Mama," Elsie whispered. "But it's okay to be happy too." Thomas's eyes met Lydia's over his daughter's head, and in them she saw gratitude so profound it was almost painful. "Thank you," he mouthed silently. Lydia nodded, not trusting her own voice. What had she done? She'd agreed to stay for a few weeks to help a child heal, but already she could feel the threads of connection forming, dangerous and delicate. She'd come to Nevada to escape entanglement, and here she was getting tangled up in the lives of two people who needed far more than she knew how to give. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised Lydia with its comfort. She rose before dawn, when the air was still cool enough to breathe, and prepared breakfast while Thomas did the morning chores. Elsie would emerge from her room slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether yesterday's breakthrough had been real or imagined. And each day, she would take Lydia's hand at the table, a silent request for reassurance that Lydia never refused. Breakfast conversation was minimal at first. Thomas was not a talkative man by nature, and Elsie's words came in careful dribs and drabs, as if she were rationing them, afraid they might run out. But gradually, as the week progressed, the silence became less heavy. Thomas would mention needing to ride into town for supplies. Elsie would ask Lydia to help her gather eggs. Small exchanges, ordinary and mundane, but each one felt like a small victory against the grief that had held this household in its grip. Lydia threw herself into making the house livable again. Sarah's room became hers in truth, though she carefully stored away the other woman's possessions with respect, folding the dresses and placing them in the chest, wrapping the hairbrush in cloth. She scrubbed floors that hadn't been properly cleaned in months, beat dust from curtains, reorganized the kitchen shelves so she could find what she needed. It was work she'd never done before. Her family had employed servants for such things, but she found an unexpected satisfaction in it, in taking something broken and making it whole again. Thomas watched her work with a mixture of amazement and discomfort. "You don't have to do all that," he said one afternoon, finding her scrubbing the front porch. "I hired you to help with Elsie, not to be a housemaid." "Elsie lives in this house," Lydia pointed out, pushing a strand of hair from her sweaty forehead. "A clean, organized home will be better for her. Besides, I need to earn my keep." "You're earning it by giving me my daughter back." Thomas's voice was quiet but intense. "The rest is extra." Lydia sat back on her heels, studying him. In the time she'd been here, she'd begun to understand Thomas Crowell better. He was a proud man, made uncomfortable by accepting help, by being vulnerable. His solution to grief had been to retreat, to isolate, to handle everything alone. But isolation hadn't worked. It had only made things worse for him and for Elsie. Now he was being forced to let someone in, and it clearly didn't sit easy with him. "Mr. Crowell," she said gently, "there's no shame in needing help. We all need it sometimes." He looked away, jaw tight. I should have been enough for her. A father should be enough. A father is not meant to be everything. Children need more than one person in their lives, more than one kind of love. Lydia stood, wringing out her rag. "You've done remarkably well under impossible circumstances, but you don't have to do it alone anymore. At least not for now." The "for now" was deliberate, a reminder to both of them that this was temporary, that she would be leaving eventually. But even as she said it, Lydia felt something twist in her chest, something that whispered this was already more than temporary, that she was already becoming attached in ways that would hurt when it came time to leave. Thomas must have heard something in her voice because his eyes sharpened. "How long are you planning to stay, Miss Hale? Really?" "I don't know," Lydia admitted. "I suppose until Elsie is fully speaking again, until she seems stable. A few more weeks, perhaps? And then what? Where will you go?" It was the question Lydia had been avoiding asking herself. "I'll figure something out. Perhaps there's work in Carson Springs or another town. I'm adaptable." "Are you?" Thomas's tone was skeptical. "Because you don't strike me as someone who's accustomed to frontier living, Miss Hale. Your hands are soft, your manners are refined. You come from somewhere else, somewhere comfortable. What brought you so low that you'd answer a marriage advertisement from a con artist?" The question was invasive, but Lydia found she didn't have the energy to be offended. "My father died," she said simply. "He left debts. My brother's wife didn't want me staying with them. And then there was an incident. Someone told lies about me, or perhaps truths that looked like lies. Either way, Philadelphia became impossible. So yes, I answered an advertisement. It seemed like the best of my limited options." She met his eyes squarely. "We all have our stories, Mr. Crowell. We all have reasons for ending up in places we never expected to be sub." Something in Thomas's expression softened. "I suppose that's true enough. I'm sorry about your father, and about whoever hurt you. And I'm sorry about Sarah, about everything you and Elsie have endured." They stood there for a moment, two damaged people acknowledging each other's wounds, and Lydia felt the dynamics between them shift slightly. Not quite friendship, that would take longer, but perhaps the beginning of mutual respect. "I need to ride into town tomorrow," Thomas said abruptly. "Get some supplies. Check on a job someone mentioned might be available. Would you be all right here with Elsie?" "Of course. We'll manage fine. She's never been alone with anyone but me since Sarah died. If she gets upset, then I'll comfort her. Mr. Crowell, I'm not going to let anything happen to your daughter. You have to trust me at least that much." Thomas nodded slowly. "I do trust you. That's what worries me. I've learned not to trust easily, Miss Hale. It's safer that way, but you've made that impossible." He walked away before she could respond, leaving Lydia standing on the half-scrubbed porch, her heart doing complicated things in her chest that she absolutely did not want to examine too closely. That evening, after supper was cleared and Thomas had gone to check on the animals one last time, Lydia sat with Elsie in the rocking chair by the window. The child was teaching her a hand-clapping game, something her mother had apparently taught her, and Elsie's giggles, soft and rusty from disuse but genuine, filled the room like music. "Miss Lydia?" Elsie said when the game ended. "Are you going to be my new mama?" The question hit Lydia like a physical blow. "Oh, sweetheart, no, I'm helping for a while, that's all. But I want you to stay. Papa likes you, I can tell. Your father is grateful for the help. That's different from—" "Elsie, this is complicated." "Why?" The child's logic was simple, unburdened by adult understanding of social conventions and appropriate behavior. "You don't have anywhere else to go. Papa needs help. I want you here. Why can't you just stay?" Because staying meant attachment, and attachment meant pain when things inevitably fell apart, because Lydia had learned the hard way that happily ever after was a fairy tale, not a reality. Because she couldn't bear to care for these people and then have something tear them all apart again. But she couldn't say any of that to a 7-year-old girl who'd already lost too much. "We'll see," Lydia said instead, the coward's answer. "For now, let's just take things one day at a time. Can you do that?" Elsie looked disappointed but nodded. "One day at a time," she repeated solemnly. Then, "Will you sing to me? Mama used to sing before bed. I don't know what songs your mama knew. Any song. Just something pretty." So Lydia sang, her voice uncertain at first but growing stronger, an old lullaby her own mother had sung decades ago. Elsie's eyes drifted closed, her breathing evening out, and by the time Thomas came back inside, Lydia was still sitting in the rocking chair holding his sleeping daughter, tears running silently down her own face for all the mothers lost, all the children left behind, all the makeshift families trying desperately to hold together in a world that seemed determined to tear everything apart. Thomas crossed the room quietly and lifted Elsie from Lydia's arms. "I'll put her to bed," he whispered. When he returned, he found Lydia still in the chair, wiping her eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "I'm fine. Just tired, I think. It's been an emotional few days." "That's one way to put it." Thomas pulled out a chair from the table and sat, facing her. "She asked you to stay permanently, didn't she? I heard part of your conversation." "Yes, I tried to explain—" "I know, and you were right to manage her expectations. But Miss Hale, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "If you do decide to leave, will you give us warning? Will you let me prepare Elsie? Talk to her about it first? I can't have her waking up one morning and finding you gone the way she found Sarah gone. I can't survive her going silent again." The weight of that responsibility settled on Lydia's shoulders like a stone. "I promise," she said quietly. "Whatever happens, I won't just disappear. You have my word." Thomas nodded, seeming satisfied. "That's all I ask. Now you should get some rest. Tomorrow will be busy with me gone." Lydia did go to bed, but sleep was elusive. She lay in Sarah's room, in her room now, she supposed, and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the sound was so lonely it made her chest ache. She'd come to Nevada running from one disaster and had stumbled straight into another. The difference was that this disaster wasn't of her own making, and maybe, just maybe, she could actually help fix it instead of making it worse. The question was whether she had the courage to try, knowing that success would mean getting attached to people she'd eventually have to leave, and failure would mean hurting a child who'd already been hurt enough for 3 lifetimes. Outside, the night pressed close, and somewhere in the darkness, the future waited with all its terrible uncertainties, and Lydia closed her eyes and prayed for wisdom she wasn't sure she possessed and strength she definitely didn't feel. The morning Thomas left for town, Lydia woke to find Elsie already dressed and sitting on the porch steps, watching the horizon where her father had disappeared on horseback an hour before. The child's small frame was rigid with anxiety, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He'll be back before dark," Lydia said gently, sitting down beside her. "He promised, remember?" "Mama promised too," Elsie whispered. "She said she'd get better. She said not to worry." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with a child's understanding that promises could be broken, that the people you loved could leave without warning. Lydia put her arm around Elsie's thin shoulders and felt the girl lean against her, still watching that empty horizon. "Your father is strong and healthy. He's making a simple trip to town. That's very different from your mother being sick." Lydia chose her words carefully, knowing that false reassurance would only damage the fragile trust Elsie was beginning to place in her. "But you're right that we can't always know what will happen. All we can do is hope for the best and be here for each other while we wait." Elsie nodded against her shoulder. "Will you wait with me?" "Every minute," Lydia promised. "Now, how about we make today special? We could gather wildflowers from the prairie, or I could teach you a new song, or we could bake something sweet for your father's return. What sounds good to you?" "All of it," Elsie said, and there was a hint of her childhood showing through the grief, that simple desire to do everything at once that belonged to someone who hadn't yet learned about limitations and loss. They spent the morning gathering flowers, venturing farther from the homestead than Lydia had gone before. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, dotted with sage and scrub, and the heat was already building despite the early hour. Elsie knew the names of some of the wildflowers her mother had taught her, and spoke them in her quiet, careful way. Indian paintbrush, desert marigold, evening primrose that closed up tight against the morning sun. "Mama said the land looks harsh, but it's really full of beautiful things if you know where to look," Elsie said, holding up a cluster of tiny purple flowers Lydia couldn't name. She said people are like that too. Sometimes the ones who seem hardest have the most beauty inside. "Your mama was very wise," Lydia said, tucking a flower behind Elsie's ear. "And she was right. Your father might seem hard sometimes, but that's just because he's been hurt. Inside, he's full of love for you." "Is that why he doesn't smile much? Because he's hurt?" "Yes, I think so." Elsie considered this, picking more flowers with careful concentration. "Are you hurt too, Miss Lydia? Is that why you came here all alone?" The question was so direct, so innocent, that Lydia found herself answering honestly. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm hurt too. Different hurts than your father's, but hurts just the same." "Maybe that's why you understand," Elsie said with the simple logic of childhood. "Maybe hurt people can help each other better because they know what it feels like." Lydia felt something crack open in her chest, some protective shell she'd been carrying. "Maybe so," she managed. "Maybe that's exactly why." They returned to the house with arms full of flowers, and Lydia showed Elsie how to arrange them in jars of water, creating small explosions of color throughout the dim interior. Then they baked, Lydia working from half-remembered recipes her own mother's cook had made, Elsie helping measure and stir with the intense focus of someone performing an important task. The kitchen grew hot from the oven, but neither of them complained. There was something sacred in the work, in creating something sweet and nourishing together. By early afternoon, they had produced a somewhat lopsided cake that smelled of vanilla and hope. Elsie decorated it with some of the flowers, and they stood back to admire their handiwork. "Papa's going to love it," Elsie declared with satisfaction. "I'm sure he will. Now it's too hot to do much else. What do you say we rest in the shade, and I'll tell you a story?" They settled on the porch, Lydia in the rocking chair, and Elsie on a small stool at her feet, and Lydia found herself telling stories she'd half forgotten from her own childhood. Tales of clever girls who outwitted giants, of kind hearts rewarded, of families found in unexpected places. Elsie listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions, sometimes just sitting quietly with a small smile on her face. The afternoon stretched long and drowsy, and at some point Elsie fell asleep leaning against Lydia's legs, her breathing soft and even. Lydia continued rocking gently, not wanting to disturb the child, watching the heat shimmer across the prairie and thinking about hurt people helping each other, about beauty hidden in harsh places, about how she'd somehow stumbled into something that felt dangerously close to belonging. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon when Lydia spotted movement in the distance, a rider coming fast. Too fast. Her stomach clenched with sudden dread. Thomas had said he'd be back before dark, but this was earlier than expected, and there was something urgent in the way the horse was being driven. "Elsie," she said gently, shaking the child's shoulder. "Elsie, wake up. Someone's coming." Elsie jerked awake, immediately anxious. "Is it Papa?" "I think so. But something might be wrong. He's riding very fast." They both stood, watching as the rider grew closer, resolving into Thomas on his bay horse, pushing the animal harder than was wise in the heat. When he finally reached the yard, he dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, his face grim and set. "Papa!" Elsie ran to him, but stopped short at his expression. "What's wrong?" Thomas pulled her into a quick, fierce hug, then looked at Lydia over his daughter's head. "We need to talk." "Inside." Lydia's mouth went dry. Something in his tone, and the way he wouldn't quite meet her eyes, told her that whatever news he'd brought back from town was going to change everything. She followed them into the house, her heart hammering against her ribs. Thomas waited until Elsie was settled at the table before he spoke. "I ran into the station master while I was in town. He had something for you, Miss Hale. A telegram that came 2 days ago. He didn't know where to find you to deliver it." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and set it on the table. Lydia stared at it as if it were a snake. Who would be sending her telegrams? Her brother knew she'd left Philadelphia, but they'd parted on such poor terms that she couldn't imagine him reaching out. Unless something terrible had happened. Unless someone had died. With trembling hands, she unfolded the telegram and read the brief, impersonal message. Father's business partner. Confession. Stop. Debts cleared. Your name cleared. Stop. Return immediately. Stop. Brother. Lydia read it 3 times, the words refusing to make sense. Her father's business partner had confessed to something? The debts that had driven her from her home were cleared? Her name was cleared? She looked up at Thomas, confusion and shock warring on her face. I don't understand, she said. My father died owing money to half of Philadelphia. His partner, Mr. Thornton, he told everyone my father had been embezzling, that the business failure was entirely my father's fault. That's part of why I had to leave. The scandal was everywhere. But if he's confessed to something, sounds like maybe he was the one embezzling, Thomas said quietly, and he let your father take the blame. The implications crashed over Lydia like a wave. If the debts were cleared, if her name was cleared, then she could go home. She could reclaim her position in Philadelphia society, could stay with her brother without being a burden or an embarrassment, could rebuild the life she'd lost. Everything she'd left behind, everything she'd mourned, could be hers again. You're leaving, Elsie said, her voice small and breaking. You're going back to Philadelphia. I don't know, Lydia said, though even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't true. Of course she would go back. What choice did she have? This opportunity might not come again. If she stayed here, what would she be? A housekeeper in a widower's home, living on the charity of a man who'd made clear from the beginning that her presence was temporary? She couldn't build a life on that foundation. But the look on Elsie's face was destroying her. When? Thomas asked, his voice carefully neutral. When would you need to leave? There's a train day after tomorrow. If I'm going to go, that would be the logical time. Lydia's mind was racing, trying to think through all the implications, all the logistics. She'd need money for the fare, which she didn't have. She'd need to retrieve her trunk from where she'd hidden it at the station. She'd need to. I'll take you to the station, Thomas said. I'll give you money for the fare. Consider it payment for the work you've done here. No. Elsie stood up so fast her chair fell backward with a crash. No, you can't go. You promised you wouldn't leave without telling us first. You promised. Elsie, I did tell you. You said you'd give us warning. You said you wouldn't just disappear, said. Tears were streaming down the child's face now, her voice rising to something close to a scream. 2 days isn't warning. 2 days isn't enough. Elsie, calm down. Thomas reached for his daughter, but she jerked away from him, backing toward the door. You're just like Mama. You said you'd stay. You made me trust you, and now you're leaving. Everyone leaves. Her small body was shaking with the force of her emotions, 8 months of buried grief and fear pouring out all at once. I hate you. I hate you for making me love you. She ran from the house before either of them could stop her, the door slamming behind her. Through the window, Lydia watched her race toward the barn, her small figure stumbling in her haste. I should go after her, Lydia said, already moving toward the door. No. Thomas's hand on her arm stopped her. Let her be for a moment. She needs to cry this out. If you go now, you'll just make it worse. I made it worse by agreeing to stay in the first place. Lydia's own tears were threatening now. You warned me at the beginning, Mr. Crowell. You said you couldn't take on responsibilities that weren't yours. I should have listened. I should have kept walking that first morning. But you didn't, and for a few weeks my daughter was happy again. She spoke. She laughed. That's more than I could have given her alone. Thomas's grip on her arm tightened slightly. You gave us that, Miss Hale. Whatever happens now, that gift can't be taken back. It feels like I'm taking it back. It feels like I'm abandoning you both. You're not abandoning us. You're going back to your real life, the life you should have had all along. That's different. But was it? Lydia wasn't sure anymore. Philadelphia suddenly seemed very far away, a dream from another lifetime. The woman who'd left there 3 weeks ago felt like a stranger. Could she really go back and pretend none of this had happened? That she hadn't held a grieving child and felt her speak for the first time in months? That she hadn't scrubbed floors and gathered eggs and learned the names of desert wildflowers? I don't know what to do, she admitted. Part of me wants to stay, but that's not rational. I have nothing here. No security, no future. In Philadelphia, I have family, a home, a chance at a normal life. Then go, Thomas said, and his voice had gone hard again, defensive. You're right. You have nothing here. We're not your responsibility, Miss Hale. We managed before you came, and we'll manage after you're gone. He released her arm and walked to the window, staring out toward the barn where his daughter was hiding. The set of his shoulders told Lydia that the conversation was over, that he'd retreated back behind the walls he'd briefly lowered. She wanted to say something more, to explain, to make him understand, but what was there to say? He was right. She had no real claim on this life, no justification for staying beyond sentiment and a child's tears. Lydia went to her room, Sarah's room, and sat on the bed, the telegram still clutched in her hand. She should be overjoyed. She should be packing, planning, celebrating this incredible stroke of fortune. Her name was cleared. She could go home. So why did it feel like she was being torn in half? That night, none of them ate dinner. Elsie stayed in the barn until well after dark, and when she finally emerged, she went straight to her room without speaking to either Lydia or Thomas. Lydia could hear her crying through the thin walls, soft, heartbroken sobs that cut deeper than screaming would have. Thomas sat at the table, a glass of whiskey in front of him that he didn't drink, just stared at. Lydia sat across from him, the silence between them heavy with everything they weren't saying. I'll write to her, Lydia finally said. From Philadelphia. I'll send letters so she knows I'm thinking of her. Letters? Thomas laughed bitterly. Letters from someone she'll never see again. That'll be a real comfort. What do you want me to do? Lydia demanded, frustration breaking through her guilt. Stay here out of obligation? Build a life on nothing but a child's attachment and your temporary gratitude? We both know that's not sustainable. Eventually, you'll resent me for being here, for costing money you don't have, for not being Sarah. And then what? We'll all be miserable instead of just sad. You're right, Thomas said flatly. You should go. Tomorrow, if possible. No point dragging it out. Tomorrow? Lydia felt her stomach drop. But I said the day after. Why wait? The longer you stay, the harder it'll be for Elsie. Better to rip the bandage off fast. I'll take you to town at first light. You can wait at the hotel until the train comes. I'll pay for the room and the fare, like I said. It was the cruelty of kindness, Lydia realized. He was trying to make this easier by making it brutal, by removing any chance for second thoughts or drawn-out goodbyes. And perhaps he was right. Perhaps clean and fast was better than lingering and painful. All right, she heard herself say. Tomorrow, then. Thomas nodded and finally took a drink of his whiskey, draining half the glass in one swallow. You should pack tonight. We'll leave before Elsie wakes up. Easier that way. You want me to leave without saying goodbye to her? Lydia's voice rose in disbelief. After everything we just said about not disappearing on her? I'll explain after you're gone. I'll tell her you had to catch an early train, that there wasn't time for goodbyes. She'll be angry at me instead of hurt by you. That's absurd. She'll be hurt either way, and angry at both of us. Then let her be angry at me. I can handle her anger. I'm her father. It's my job. Thomas stood abruptly, swaying slightly. I'm going to check the animals one more time. You should get some rest. It's a long ride to town. He left before Lydia could argue further, and she sat alone in the dim lamplight, wondering how everything had fallen apart so quickly. This morning she'd been gathering flowers with Elsie, baking cake, telling stories. They'd been happy. And now, less than 12 hours later, she was preparing to leave before dawn like a thief, and a little girl was crying herself to sleep in the next room. Lydia did pack, though her hands shook so badly she could barely fold her clothes. The few things she'd unpacked, the dresses she'd borrowed from Sarah's collection, all went back into her carpet bag. She looked around the room one last time, at the quilt on the bed, and the flowers wilting in jars on the small table, and felt something inside her chest crack clean through. She couldn't sleep. How could she, knowing what dawn would bring? Instead, she lay in the darkness and listened to the house settle around her, to Elsie's eventual silence as the child cried herself into exhaustion, to Thomas's heavy footsteps when he finally came back inside much later, stumbling slightly as he made his way to his own room. Around 3 in the morning, Lydia heard Elsie's door open. Small feet padded across the main room, then stopped outside Lydia's door. She held her breath, waiting. After a long moment, there was a soft knock. "Miss Lydia?" Elsie's voice was hoarse from crying. "Are you awake?" Lydia could have pretended to sleep. It would have been easier, but she couldn't do that to the child. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm awake." The door opened slowly, and Elsie stood in the doorway, illuminated by the moonlight coming through the window. She was wearing her nightgown, her feet bare, her face swollen from tears. "I heard you and Papa talking. You're leaving in the morning." "Yes." There was no point in lying, without saying goodbye. "Your father thought it would be easier that way." "Papa's wrong." Elsie came into the room and climbed onto the bed, curling against Lydia's side the way she had that first night. "Nothing about this is easy." Lydia put her arm around the child, pulling her close. "No," she agreed softly. "Nothing about this is easy at all." They lay there together in the darkness, and Lydia felt Elsie's tears soaking through her nightgown, felt her own tears sliding silently down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to hurt you, Elsie. I care about you so much." "Then stay." Elsie's voice was muffled against her shoulder. "If you really care, stay." "It's more complicated than that." "Why?" "Grown-ups always say things are complicated, but they're not. You either want to be here or you don't. You either want to be with us or you don't." "I do want to be with you, but wanting something doesn't always mean it's the right choice." "Why not?" The question was so simple, so devastatingly direct. Why shouldn't wanting something be enough reason to choose it? Because the world didn't work that way, Lydia wanted to say. Because security and social standing and family expectations mattered. Because building a life on emotion alone was foolish and dangerous. Because she'd already made that mistake once, trusting her heart over her head, and it had ended in scandal and exile. But looking down at Elsie's tear-stained face, at this child who'd lost her mother and was now losing the first person she'd trusted since, Lydia wondered if maybe she'd learned the wrong lessons from her past. Maybe the mistake hadn't been trusting her heart. Maybe the mistake had been trusting the wrong person. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "I thought I had all the answers, but now I don't know anything anymore." "Will you at least say goodbye tomorrow? Really say it," Elsie pleaded. "Don't just disappear while I'm sleeping. Please." Lydia thought of Thomas's plan, his belief that a quick, clean break would be better. But she also thought about promises made and trust given, about a child who'd already had too many people leave without proper goodbyes. "Yes," she said, "I promise. I'll wake you before I leave, and we'll say goodbye properly." Elsie nodded against her shoulder, then whispered, "I drew you something for you to take with you, so you'll remember us." "I could never forget you, Elsie. Not ever." "Promise?" "I promise." They stayed like that until Elsie finally fell asleep, exhausted from emotion. Lydia carefully extracted herself and carried the child back to her own bed, tucking her in and pressing a kiss to her forehead. In the moonlight, Elsie looked younger than her 7 years, vulnerable and small, and Lydia had to turn away before the sight unmade her completely. Back in her own room, Lydia sat on the edge of the bed and watched the sky slowly lighten from black to gray. Dawn was coming, and with it the moment when she'd have to choose. Philadelphia meant safety, respectability, the chance to reclaim everything she'd lost. But staying meant uncertainty, possible scandal, and a life built on nothing but hope and the desperate need of 2 people who'd already been broken once. The smart choice was obvious. The safe choice was clear. So why did every instinct in her body scream that leaving would be the biggest mistake of her life? When the first pink light touched the horizon, Lydia heard Thomas moving in the main room, preparing for the journey to town. She stood slowly, picked up her carpet bag, and opened the door. He looked up, his face haggard, and she could see he hadn't slept either. "I'm ready," she said. He nodded and reached for his hat. "I'll saddle the horse. We can be in town by mid-morning if we leave now." "Wait." Lydia's voice stopped him at the door. "I need to wake Elsie. I promised her a real goodbye." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Miss Hale, I really think—" "I know what you think, but I made a promise, and I'm going to keep it. If that makes this harder, I'm sorry, but it's necessary." For a moment, she thought he might argue. Then he just nodded tiredly and went outside, leaving her to face the hardest goodbye of her life. Lydia went to Elsie's room and sat on the edge of the small bed, gently shaking the child's shoulder. "Elsie, wake up! It's time!" Elsie's eyes opened, and for a second there was hope in them, as if she'd thought maybe it had all been a bad dream. Then reality crashed back and her face crumpled. "You're really going?" "Yes." Lydia pulled her into a tight embrace. "But I want you to know something. These past few weeks have meant everything to me. You've taught me so much about courage and love and healing. I'll carry that with me always." "It's not enough." Elsie was crying again, clinging to Lydia with desperate strength. "I don't want you to carry memories. I want you to stay here and make new ones." "I know, sweetheart. I know." "Will you write to me?" "Really write, not just once and then forget." "Every week. I'll tell you about Philadelphia, and you can tell me about the prairie and the flowers and everything you're learning. Our friendship doesn't have to end just because I'm far away." But even as she said it, Lydia knew it was a lie. Friendships built on letters weren't the same as friendships built on shared mornings and flower gathering and cake baking. Distance would erode what they'd built here, no matter how many letters they exchanged. Eventually, the words would come less frequently, mean less, until they were just empty formalities sent out of obligation rather than love. Elsie seemed to know it too. "You're going to forget about us," she said flatly. "Once you're back with your real family, with your real life, we'll just be people you used to know." "That's not true." "Yes, it is. Mama used to tell me about her life before she came here. She had friends in Missouri, a whole town of people she knew. But after she came to Nevada, she never saw any of them again. She wrote for a while, but they stopped writing back. That's what happens. People leave, and they forget." The resignation in Elsie's voice was worse than her tears had been. This was a child learning too young that love wasn't enough, that people were temporary, that attachment only led to loss. And Lydia was teaching her that lesson, confirming every terrible truth Sarah's death had whispered. "I'm so sorry," was all Lydia could say, knowing it was inadequate. "I wish things were different." "Then make them different." Elsie pulled back, her red-rimmed eyes fierce despite the tears. "You're a grown-up. You get to choose, so choose us." Before Lydia could respond, Thomas appeared in the doorway. "The horse is ready. We need to go if you're going to make that train." Elsie turned to her father, and her voice went cold in a way that made Lydia's heart break all over again. "You're making her leave, aren't you? You're too scared to let someone stay, so you're pushing her away." "Elsie, that's not fair." Thomas's voice was strained. "Miss Hale has a life waiting for her, a real life, with her family. We can't ask her to give that up." "Why not? She's family to me." The words hung in the air, and Lydia saw Thomas flinch as if struck. She saw the moment his walls came back up completely, his face going blank and hard. "Miss Hale, the horse is waiting." There was nothing left to say. Lydia kissed Elsie's forehead one last time, whispered another promise she wasn't sure she could keep, and followed Thomas out of the house. Behind her, she heard Elsie's sobs begin again, and it took every ounce of willpower she possessed not to turn around and run back. The ride to town was silent and miserable. Thomas sat rigid in the saddle, his jaw tight, and Lydia rode behind him, her arms loosely around his waist for balance, both of them acutely aware of every point of contact and desperately trying not to be. The sun climbed higher, turning the prairie into a furnace, and dust clung to their clothes and skin. They were perhaps halfway to Carson Springs when Lydia's mind finally caught up with what her heart had been screaming since dawn. She was making a terrible mistake. Philadelphia offered safety, but it didn't offer life. It didn't offer the fierce love of a broken child or the possibility of helping someone heal. It didn't offer mornings gathering wildflowers or evenings rocking in a chair while teaching hand-clapping games. It offered respectability and security and a slow death of everything that made her feel truly alive. "Stop," she said suddenly. Thomas pulled the horse up, turning slightly to look at her over his shoulder. "What's wrong?" "Everything. This whole thing is wrong." Lydia slid down from the horse, her legs shaking. "I can't do this. I can't leave." Thomas dismounted as well, facing her with an expression she couldn't read. "Miss Hale, You're just feeling guilty. Once you're back in Philadelphia, once you're with your family again, I'll be miserable, Lydia interrupted. I'll be safe and respectable and completely miserable. Thomas, Mr. Crowell, I don't want that life anymore. I want this one. This harsh, difficult, uncertain life where a little girl needs me and you need me, whether you'll admit it or not. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. For the first time in months, maybe years, I know exactly what I want. I want to stay. Thomas's face was a battlefield of emotions, hope and fear, and something else warring for dominance. And what about your family? Your name being cleared? You'd give that up? My brother made it clear I wasn't wanted even when I was blameless. Having my name cleared changes the social circumstances, not the personal ones. And as for the rest of Philadelphia society, Lydia laughed, surprised by how light she suddenly felt. I spent 26 years trying to meet their expectations, trying to be what they wanted me to be. And where did it get me? Betrayed and exiled. Maybe it's time I stopped living for their approval and started living for something real. This is real, Thomas said roughly. Too real. It's hard work and isolation and a future with no guarantees. You think you want it now, but give it 6 months of winter cold and summer heat, of making do with almost nothing, of being so far from everything you've known that you forget what civilization feels like. I know it won't be easy, but easy isn't what I need anymore. I need to matter. I need to be somewhere I'm not just tolerated, but genuinely wanted. Lydia stepped closer to him, searching his face. Tell me the truth, Thomas. Do you want me to go? Really want it? He looked away, his hands clenching at his sides. What I want doesn't matter. It matters to me. It should matter to you too. You know what I want? Thomas's voice rose, anger finally breaking through his control. I want my wife back. I want Sarah alive and healthy. I want my daughter to have never seen her mother die. I want the last 8 months to be a nightmare I can wake up from. But I can't have any of that. So what I want is irrelevant, Miss Hale. We deal with what is, not with what we wish could be. You're right, Lydia said quietly. We can't change the past, but we can choose the future. And I'm choosing this. I'm choosing to stay, to help, to be part of whatever family the three of us can build together. The question is whether you'll let me. Thomas finally looked at her again, and in his eyes she saw such desperate longing mixed with terror that it took her breath away. You'll regret it, he said hoarsely. 6 months from now, a year from now, you'll wake up and realize you've thrown away everything for a man you barely know and a child who isn't yours. Maybe. Or maybe I'll wake up and realize I finally found where I belong. Either way, it'll be my choice. Mine. Lydia reached out and took his hand, feeling it tremble slightly in hers. Let me make it, Thomas. Let me choose this life. For a long moment, they stood there in the blazing prairie sun, hands joined, the future hanging in the balance. Then Thomas's fingers tightened around hers, and she saw something in his face crack and crumble. All those walls he'd built coming down at once. Come back with me, he said, his voice raw. Come back home. Home. The word settled into Lydia's chest like a key finding its lock, and she found herself nodding, smiling despite the tears running down her face. Yes, let's go home. They rode back the way they'd come, faster now, urgent, and Lydia felt something like joy building in her chest, mixed with terror and relief, and a bone-deep certainty that this was right, that this was where she needed to be. When the homestead came into view, they saw Elsie sitting on the porch steps exactly where she'd been that morning, her small figure hunched in on itself. She looked up as they approached, and for a moment confusion flickered across her face. Then understanding dawned, and she was running, racing across the yard with a cry that was half sob, half laugh. Lydia barely had time to dismount before Elsie threw herself into her arms with such force they both nearly fell. "You came back!" Elsie gasped. "You came back! You came back!" "I came back," Lydia confirmed, holding the child tight, feeling Thomas's hand on her shoulder, the three of them forming a circle in the dust and heat and endless prairie light. "I'm not going anywhere, Elsie. This is where I belong." That night, after Elsie had finally fallen asleep, Exhausted from the emotional upheaval of the day, Lydia found Thomas sitting on the porch in the darkness, staring out at the prairie. The heat had barely diminished with sunset, and the air was thick and still, pressing down on everything like a weighted blanket. "May I join you?" she asked softly. He nodded, and she sat in the other chair, the wood creaking under her weight. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them had changed since morning. It was no longer the silence of strangers or even of people working together toward a common goal. It was something deeper, more complicated, threaded through with unspoken questions and possibilities that neither of them quite knew how to voice. "I need to send a telegram to my brother," Lydia finally said. "Let him know I won't be returning." "What will you tell him?" "The truth, I suppose. That I found work here, that I'm staying." She hesitated. "He won't understand. He'll think I've lost my mind, throwing away the chance to come home." "Have you?" Thomas asked quietly. "Lost your mind?" "Probably." Lydia laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Everything I was taught, everything I believed about what made a good life, security, social standing, family connections, I'm walking away from all of it. By any reasonable measure, I'm making a terrible choice." But I've spent my whole life making reasonable choices, and they left me alone and desperate, answering marriage advertisements from con artists. Maybe it's time I tried something unreasonable. She turned to look at him, his profile barely visible in the starlight. "We should talk about the practical aspects. I can't just live here indefinitely without some kind of arrangement. People will talk, even in a dying town." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his hands gripping the chair arms. "I've been thinking about that. There are a few options. I could pay you a wage as Elsie's governess and housekeeper, make it a proper employment situation. It's not much money, but it would be something. And what happens when people ask why a governess is living under your roof without any other staff? It still looks improper." "I know." Thomas's voice was strained. "The other option would be to... That is, we could..." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Lydia's heart began to pound. She knew what he was trying to say, what solution would silence any gossip and make her position secure. Marriage. The very thing she'd come to Nevada seeking, though from a different man and under vastly different circumstances. But suggesting marriage now, when they barely knew each other, when his wife had been dead less than a year, when everything between them was built on crisis and need rather than courtship and choice, it seemed almost obscene. "It's too soon," she said gently, "for both of us. You're still grieving, Sarah, and I'm still figuring out who I am outside of Philadelphia society. Getting married now would be for all the wrong reasons." The relief on Thomas's face was palpable. "You're right. Of course you're right. I just thought, people will talk regardless. At least if we were married, Elsie would be protected from the gossip." "Elsie will be fine. Children are more resilient than adults give them credit for." Lydia reached over and briefly touched his hand. "Let's take this slowly. I'll be your employee for now, and we'll deal with the gossip if and when it becomes a problem. The nearest neighbor is miles away, and the town is barely hanging on. I doubt anyone has the energy to care about the propriety of our arrangement. And if they do care, if the gossip gets bad, then we'll face it together, all three of us." She squeezed his hand once before releasing it. "I'm not afraid of gossip, Thomas. I lived through scandal in Philadelphia. Whatever Carson Springs can throw at us will be mild by comparison." He nodded slowly, and some of the tension left his shoulders. "I should warn you, it's going to be hard. Harder than these past few weeks. Winter here is brutal, and we barely scrape by even in good times. You'll be working from dawn to dusk, and there won't be any of the comforts you're used to." "I haven't been used to comforts in over a year. I think I can manage." Lydia stood, suddenly exhausted from the day's emotional roller coaster. "I should get some sleep. Tomorrow we start fresh, with everything out in the open." "Lydia?" Thomas's use of her first name stopped her at the door. "Thank you for coming back, for choosing us." "Thank you for letting me," she said softly, and went inside before the tears threatening to spill could fall where he might see them. The next few weeks unfolded with a strange mixture of normalcy and underlying tension. Lydia threw herself into making the homestead functional, attacking projects that had been neglected during Thomas's months of grief-stricken survival. She mended clothes until her fingers ached, worked in the small vegetable garden Sarah had once tended, learned to preserve what little produce they could coax from the harsh soil. Her hands, once soft and pale, became rough and calloused. Her skin darkened from the relentless sun despite the bonnet she wore. She was transforming, becoming someone new, and part of her mourned while another part celebrated. Elsie bloomed under the attention, speaking more each day, though she still had moments of withdrawal when grief would wash over her without warning. Lydia learned to recognize the signs. The way Elsie's eyes would go distant, her hands would still whatever task they'd been doing. In those moments, Lydia would simply sit with her, not forcing conversation, just providing presence. Sometimes Elsie would cry. Sometimes she'd just lean against Lydia's shoulder until the wave passed. And slowly, the bad moments became less frequent, less intense. Thomas was the most complicated piece of the puzzle. He was unfailingly polite, grateful for everything Lydia did, but there was a distance between them that hadn't been there before her near departure. He'd pull back whenever they got too close, whenever a moment threatened to become intimate rather than merely friendly. Lydia understood. He was protecting himself, maintaining boundaries that kept him safe from further loss. But understanding didn't make it any less frustrating or painful. One afternoon, nearly a month after Lydia's decision to stay, she was hanging laundry when she heard raised voices from inside the house. Thomas and Elsie arguing about something. She hurried inside to find them facing off across the kitchen table, both upset. "What's going on?" Lydia asked. "Papa says I can't go." Elsie's voice was thick with tears. "It's the town social next week, and he says we're not going." Thomas's jaw was tight. "I said we'd see. That's different from a definite no." "It's the same thing. You always say we'll see, and then you find a reason why we can't." Elsie turned to Lydia desperately. "Tell him we should go. Please, Miss Lydia. There'll be music and dancing and other children. I haven't seen anyone my own age in months." Lydia looked at Thomas, trying to read his expression. "What's the social for?" "End of summer celebration. The town has one every year. What's left of the town, anyway. It's at the church hall." His tone suggested he'd rather do anything than attend. "It sounds nice. Why don't you want to go?" Thomas's hands clenched on the table. "Because people will stare. They'll whisper about you, about why you're living here, about whether it's proper. They'll pity Elsie for being motherless and me for being a widower who can't manage on his own. I don't need their pity or their judgment. So we hide out here forever? Never show our faces in town because someone might talk?" Lydia kept her voice gentle but firm. "Thomas, we can't live like hermits. Elsie needs to be around other people, other children. And honestly, so do we. You don't know what it's like. After Sarah died, people wouldn't leave me alone. Bringing food, offering advice, suggesting I should remarry quickly for Elsie's sake. As if any woman could just replace her mother, as if grief worked on a schedule." His voice was bitter with remembered pain. "I don't want to go through that again. I understand, but Elsie deserves normal experiences. Birthday parties, church socials, school when she's old enough. You can't keep her isolated because you're afraid of other people's opinions." Elsie watched this exchange with wide eyes, hope warring with the expectation of disappointment that had become her default. Lydia crossed to her and knelt, bringing herself to eye level with the child. "Would it really mean a lot to you? Going to the social?" "Yes," Elsie whispered. "I used to go with Mama. We'd dance and she'd let me stay up late and I'd eat pie until my stomach hurt. I miss it. I miss doing normal things." Lydia's heart clenched. She looked up at Thomas. "We should go, all three of us, as a family. Let them stare if they want to. Let them talk. We know the truth of our situation, and that's what matters." "Is it?" Thomas challenged. "Because from the outside, the truth looks pretty damning. A single woman living with a widower, no chaperone, no marriage. You think people won't draw conclusions? Let them draw whatever conclusions they want. I know I'm here to help with Elsie, to work for my keep. Anyone who wants to think otherwise says more about their own mind than about our situation." Lydia stood, facing him squarely. "But if you're worried about my reputation being damaged, I should tell you, I don't have much reputation left to damage. Philadelphia society already decided I was ruined. The opinions of Carson Springs can't hurt me more than that already did." Something shifted in Thomas's expression. "What happened in Philadelphia?" You've never said exactly what the scandal was. Lydia hesitated. She'd been avoiding this conversation, not wanting to burden him with her past mistakes. But if they were going to build something resembling a family, secrets would only poison the foundation. My cousin's husband began writing to me, she said quietly, aware of Elsie listening. Letters that started innocent enough, asking my advice about surprising my cousin with gifts, that sort of thing. But they became more personal. He'd confide in me about his worries, his dreams. I thought we were friends. I thought I was helping their marriage by being someone he could talk to. She laughed bitterly. I was naive. My cousin found the letters and assumed the worst. She accused me of trying to steal her husband, of carrying on an affair. It wasn't true, but the damage was done. My brother believed his wife over me, and society took her side. Within weeks, I was persona non grata. So you answered Patterson's advertisement because you had nowhere else to go, Thomas said, understanding dawning. Exactly. And look where it led me, to a stranger's barn in the middle of the Nevada desert, to a child who needed me, to a life I never could have imagined. Lydia managed a small smile. Maybe it was the best thing that could have happened. Elsie tugged on Lydia's sleeve. The people who said bad things about you were wrong. You're good. You're the best person I know. The simple, fierce loyalty in the child's voice made Lydia's eyes sting with tears. Thank you, sweetheart. That means more than you know. Thomas cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable with the emotion in the room. All right, we'll go to the social. But if it gets too uncomfortable, if people are cruel, we leave. Agreed? Agreed, Lydia said, while Elsie launched herself at her father with a squeal of delight. The week leading up to the social passed in a flurry of preparation. Lydia worked on letting out one of Sarah's dresses to fit Elsie, who'd grown in the months since her mother's death. Thomas made the trip to town to purchase fabric so Lydia could make herself something appropriate. She couldn't wear her traveling dress, which was nearly falling apart, and Sarah's clothes didn't fit her. Lydia protested the expense, but Thomas was adamant. You can't go to a social in rags. People already have enough ammunition for gossip. So Lydia spent her evenings sewing by lamplight, creating a simple dress in dark green cotton that wouldn't show the dust and dirt of prairie life. She wasn't skilled at sewing, but she did her best, and when she finally tried the finished product on, she was surprised by how well it turned out. The color brought out the green in her hazel eyes, and the simple lines suited her more than the elaborate fashions she'd worn in Philadelphia. Elsie bounced with excitement as the day approached, practicing the dance steps her mother had taught her, insisting Lydia learn them too. They waltzed awkwardly around the kitchen, Elsie humming the tunes she remembered, both of them laughing when they stumbled over each other's feet. Thomas watched these practice sessions from the doorway, his expression unreadable. Once Lydia caught him smiling, a real, genuine smile that transformed his whole face, before he realized she'd seen him and the walls came back up. The night before the social, after Elsie had gone to bed, Lydia found Thomas sitting at the table, staring at something in his hands. As she got closer, she realized it was a small daguerreotype photograph of Sarah. She was beautiful in the image, with dark hair and a shy smile, her hand resting on a young Elsie's shoulder. She would have liked you, Thomas said, without looking up. Sarah, I mean. She always said I needed someone to challenge me, to keep me from getting too set in my ways. She'd be glad you're here for Elsie. I hope so, Lydia said softly. I never want you to think I'm trying to replace her. That's not what this is. I know. Thomas finally looked up, his eyes shadowed with complex emotions. But sometimes I feel guilty for letting you in, for letting myself get used to having you here, like I'm betraying her memory by moving forward. Lydia sat down across from him. Moving forward isn't betrayal, it's survival. Sarah would want you and Elsie to be happy, wouldn't she? Yes. She made me promise, toward the end when she knew she wasn't going to make it. She made me promise I'd take care of Elsie, that I wouldn't shut the world out, that I'd let people help us. His voice cracked. I broke that promise for 8 months. I did exactly what she asked me not to do. And then you showed up, and suddenly I couldn't hide anymore. Maybe that's why I showed up. Maybe Sarah's still looking out for you both, even now. Thomas's laugh was shaky. I'd like to think so. But tomorrow night at that social, when people are whispering about us, about you, I want you to remember something. If staying here becomes too hard, If the judgment gets to be too much, I'll understand if you need to leave. I won't hold it against you." "I'm not going anywhere," Lydia said firmly. "I made my choice, Thomas. I'm not going to unmake it just because some small-minded people can't understand it." The social was held in a building that must have served as a church at some point, though Lydia suspected services were rarely held there anymore given the town's diminished population. When they arrived in the early evening, the sun was just beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Music drifted from inside, someone playing a fiddle, others clapping along. Elsie clutched Lydia's hand tightly as they approached, her earlier excitement giving way to nervousness. "What if the other children don't remember me? What if they don't want to play with me?" "Then you'll remind them who you are, and they'll be thrilled to see you again," Lydia said with more confidence than she felt. "You're wonderful, Elsie. They'd be lucky to have you as a friend." Thomas held the door open, and they stepped inside together. The room fell silent almost immediately. 20 or 30 people were scattered around the space, some dancing, some clustered in conversations, children running between the adults. All of them turned to stare at the newcomers, and Lydia felt the weight of those gazes like a physical thing. Then an older woman broke away from a group and hurried over, her face creasing into a genuine smile. "Thomas Crowell, is that really you? We'd started to think you'd left the territory entirely." She turned to Elsie, her expression softening. "And Elsie, my dear, look how you've grown. It's so good to see you out and about." "Mrs. Patterson," Thomas said stiffly. "Thank you. It's been a difficult time." Of course. We all understand." Mrs. Patterson's eyes shifted to Lydia with undisguised curiosity. "And who is this lovely young woman?" "This is Miss Lydia Hale. She's helping with Elsie and the household." Thomas's voice dared anyone to comment. "How wonderful." Mrs. Patterson took Lydia's hand warmly. "We're always glad to have new faces in Carson Springs, especially young women. There are precious few of us left. You must tell me all about yourself." Before Lydia could respond, a younger woman joined them, her smile less welcoming than Mrs. Patterson's. "A household helper? How progressive of you, Thomas. I wasn't aware you could afford to hire staff." The barb was clear, and Lydia felt Thomas stiffen beside her. "Miss Hale is working for room and board," he said coldly. "It's a mutually beneficial arrangement." "I'm sure it is," the woman said with a knowing look that made Lydia's face flame. "How very convenient." "Martha, that's enough," Mrs. Patterson said sharply. "There's no call for that tone. Miss Hale, please don't mind Martha. She forgets her manners when she's had a bit too much of the punch." Martha flushed but didn't apologize. She turned on her heel and rejoined her friends, and Lydia could see them immediately huddling together, whispering and glancing over. "I'm sorry," Thomas muttered. "We should leave." "Absolutely not," Lydia said through gritted teeth. "We came for Elsie, remember? Let's not give them the satisfaction of running us off." Mrs. Patterson beamed at her. "Well said, my dear. Now, Elsie, I believe there are some children your age over by the refreshment table. Why don't you go say hello?" Elsie looked at Lydia uncertainly. "Will you come with me?" "Of course." Lydia took her hand, and together they crossed the room, acutely aware of the whispers following them. The children, 3 girls and 2 boys, ranging from about 5 to 9 years old, looked up as they approached. "Hi," one of the girls said shyly. "Are you Elsie? I remember you from before." "Yes," Elsie whispered. "This is Miss Lydia. She lives with us now." "Is she your new mama?" a boy asked with childish directness. "No, she's my friend." Elsie's hand tightened on Lydia's. "My best friend." The children accepted this easily, as children do, and within minutes Elsie was swept up in their games, running and laughing as if the past months of silence had never happened. Lydia watched, her heart full, until a hand on her elbow made her turn. Thomas stood beside her, holding 2 cups of punch. "You should have something to drink. It's warm in here." She accepted the cup gratefully and took a sip. The punch was overly sweet and slightly fermented, but it was wet, and that was enough. Around them, the social resumed its previous energy, though Lydia could still feel curious eyes on them. "They're talking about us," she murmured. "Let them talk. You were right earlier. We know the truth, and that's what matters." Thomas surprised her by moving slightly closer. a subtle statement of solidarity. Besides, you look beautiful tonight. Let them talk about that instead. The compliment caught Lydia completely off guard. She looked at him, searching his face for sarcasm or mockery, but found only sincerity. "Thank you," she managed. "That's... You didn't have to say that." "I know, but it's true." He looked away, suddenly uncomfortable. "Sarah used to say I didn't compliment her enough, that I took her for granted. I don't want to make that mistake again." Before Lydia could respond, the fiddler struck up a new tune, and couples began forming on the makeshift dance floor. Thomas set down his cup and held out his hand with visible reluctance. "Would you dance? People are less likely to gossip if we act normal." "Is that the only reason?" Lydia asked, taking his hand and letting him lead her to the floor. "No," he admitted quietly as they began to move together. I wanted to." Dancing with Thomas was different from the practice sessions with Elsie. He held her properly, but carefully, as if she were made of glass and might shatter at too firm a touch. Lydia found herself acutely aware of every point of contact, his hand on her waist, her hand in his, the small space between them that felt both too much and not enough. "You're a good dancer," she said, needing to break the charged silence. "Sarah taught me. I had 2 left feet when we married, and she was patient enough to train me." A shadow passed over his face. "This is the first time I've danced since she died. We can stop if it's too painful." "No." His grip on her hand tightened slightly. "It hurts, but it also feels right, like I'm honoring her memory by living instead of just existing." They danced through 2 more songs, and gradually Lydia noticed Thomas relaxing, the rigid tension leaving his shoulders. Once she even saw him smile at something she said, a real smile that reached his eyes. And when the music ended and they stepped apart, she felt the loss of his touch like a physical thing. The evening progressed with surprising pleasantness. Mrs. Patterson introduced Lydia to several other women, most of whom were polite if reserved. A few were openly curious, asking pointed questions about her background and her plans, but Lydia answered them honestly without shame. Yes, she'd come from Philadelphia. Yes, she'd been engaged to Mr. Patterson before discovering he'd fled town. Yes, she was living at the Crowell homestead, helping with the household and Elsie's education. No, she didn't know how long she'd be staying. One day at a time. As the night wore on and the punch continued to flow, the atmosphere loosened considerably. Someone started a line dance that had everyone laughing and stumbling over the steps. Elsie danced with the other children, her face flushed with happiness, and Lydia felt tears sting her eyes at the sight of the girl so carefree and normal. It was late, well past Elsie's usual bedtime, when Thomas finally said they should head home. Elsie protested sleepily, but allowed herself to be bundled up. As they were leaving, Mrs. Patterson pulled Lydia aside. "My dear, I want you to know something. People will talk. That's inevitable in a small place like this. But don't let it drive you away. Thomas and Elsie need you. Anyone with eyes can see that you're good for them both." "Thank you," Lydia said, touched by the older woman's kindness. "That means a great deal. Just promise me something. Be careful with Thomas's heart. He loves Sarah deeply, and losing her nearly destroyed him. If you're not serious about staying, about being part of their lives long term, it would be kinder to leave now before things get more complicated." The warning was clear and not entirely unwarranted. "I am serious," Lydia said quietly. "I know this whole situation is unconventional, but I'm committed to making it work. For Elsie's sake, and for Thomas's." "And for your own?" Lydia met the woman's knowing gaze. "Yes, for my own too." The ride home was quiet, Elsie dozing against Lydia's shoulder in the wagon Thomas had borrowed for the evening. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and the prairie stretched around them in silver-edged darkness. Lydia felt Thomas's presence beside her more acutely than ever, felt the weight of possibilities and choices hanging in the air between them. When they reached the homestead, Thomas carried Elsie inside while Lydia returned the wagon to the barn. By the time she came back to the house, he'd gotten Elsie into her nightgown and tucked into bed. The child stirred as Lydia bent to kiss her forehead. "Miss Lydia, did you have fun tonight?" "I did, sweetheart. Very much." "Me too. Can we go again next time?" "There's another social at Christmas. Mrs. Patterson said. We'll see, Lydia said, then caught herself. Thomas was right. We'll see was another way of saying no without actually having to refuse. Yes, she corrected. Yes, we can go. All three of us together. Elsie smiled sleepily. Good. Because we're a family now. Families do things together. After Elsie had drifted off completely, Lydia found Thomas back on the porch, the place he seemed to retreat to whenever he needed to think. She joined him without asking permission, and for a long time they simply sat together in companionable silence. She's getting attached to you, Thomas finally said. More attached than is probably wise. I'm attached to her too, to both of you. That's what worries me. Thomas turned to face her, his expression serious in the dim light. Lydia, I need to know. Are you staying because you want to or because you feel obligated? Because if it's obligation, that's not enough foundation for what we're building here. It's not obligation, Lydia said firmly. At first, maybe it was. But now I stay because this feels like home, in a way Philadelphia never did. I stay because Elsie's laughter makes my heart feel full. I stay because... She hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. Because why? Thomas pressed. Because when I'm with you, I feel less alone. Because you make me want to be brave enough to build something real instead of just surviving. She looked at him directly. Because I'm falling in love with this life, Thomas. With all of it, the hard work and the isolation, and the possibility of becoming something more than I was. Thomas's breath caught audibly. And what about me? Is it just the life you're falling for, or... He couldn't seem to finish the question. Lydia's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. This was the moment, she realized. The moment when everything either moved forward or stayed forever frozen in careful friendship. She could retreat, play it safe, keep things as they were. Or she could be honest, take the risk, and see what happened. Both, she whispered. I'm falling for both. The life and the man. For a heartbeat, Thomas didn't move. Then he reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused against hers. I'm not ready, he said roughly. To love again, to move on completely. Sarah's only been gone 8 months. It feels too soon, too wrong. I know, and I'm not asking you to be ready. I'm just telling you the truth. The truth is complicated for me too, because when I'm with you, I feel guilty for not grieving hard enough. And when I'm grieving, I feel guilty for not appreciating what you've brought into our lives. His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand. I don't know how to balance it all. Maybe you don't have to balance it. Maybe you just have to feel what you feel and trust that it's okay to be confused and hurt and hopeful all at once. Lydia squeezed his hand. We don't have to figure everything out tonight, Thomas. We can take our time. Can we? Because Elsie's already decided you're her new mother, and the town's already decided we're living in sin, and I'm already so used to you being here that I can't remember what life was like before. His voice broke slightly. What if I mess this up? What if I hurt you or you hurt Elsie, or everything falls apart anyway despite our best intentions? Then it falls apart. But at least we'll have tried. Lydia shifted closer, bridging the careful distance between them. I'm not Sarah, Thomas. I'll never be her, and I don't want to be. But maybe I can be something else, something good in my own way. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as if trying to memorize every detail. Then, slowly, carefully, he leaned forward and pressed a kiss to her forehead. It was chaste, almost brotherly, but it held a promise of something more to come when the time was right. One day at a time, he murmured against her skin. We'll figure this out one day at a time. One day at a time, Lydia agreed, and let herself lean into him, feeling his arm come around her shoulders, anchoring her to this new life she was building. Above them, the stars continued their eternal dance, and the prairie breathed its ancient rhythms, and two broken people sat together in the darkness, learning slowly how to heal. The weeks following the social brought a subtle shift to the homestead, like the change in air pressure before a storm breaks. Thomas no longer retreated quite so far when Lydia came near. Their hands would brush during ordinary tasks, passing a dish, reaching for the same tool, and neither would pull away immediately. Elsie noticed, of course, and her drawings began to show the three of them standing closer together, sometimes with their hands joined in an unbroken circle. September arrived with cooler mornings and the first hints that summer's brutal grip was finally loosening. Lydia had been at the homestead for nearly 2 months now, and the rhythm of their days had become so familiar she sometimes forgot she'd ever lived any other way. Philadelphia seemed like a story someone had once told her about a different person entirely. One afternoon, while Elsie was napping and Thomas was repairing fence posts in the far pasture, Lydia decided to tackle the one room in the house she'd been avoiding, the small storage space where Sarah's personal belongings had been boxed away. Thomas had mentioned needing to go through them eventually, perhaps donate what could be useful to others in town, but he'd never found the courage to do it. Lydia opened the door carefully, as if Sarah's ghost might object to the intrusion. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light from the single window. Several wooden crates were stacked against one wall, their contents labeled in neat handwriting. Winter clothes, books, linens, and one smaller box, set apart from the others, marked simply personal. She shouldn't open it. It felt like a violation, like reading someone's diary. But something drew her forward, and before she could talk herself out of it, Lydia was kneeling beside the box and lifting the lid. Inside were the small treasures of a woman's life. A pair of embroidered gloves, slightly worn, a cameo brooch with a crack through one side. Letters tied with ribbon, love letters from Thomas, Lydia realized, recognizing his handwriting. And at the bottom, a leather-bound journal. Lydia's hands trembled as she lifted it out. She knew she shouldn't read it, knew it was private, but she also felt a strange compulsion, as if Sarah herself wanted her to understand something. She opened to a random page dated about a year before Sarah's death. Thomas worked himself near to exhaustion again today. I wish he would accept help when it's offered, but pride is his constant companion. I love him for his determination, but sometimes I fear it will destroy him. He believes he must shoulder everything alone, that asking for help is weakness. I pray he learns before it's too late that strength also means knowing when to lean on others. Lydia turned more pages, reading entries that painted a picture of a marriage that had been loving but not without struggle. Sarah had been lonely out here, missed her family in Missouri, sometimes resented the harsh life the prairie demanded. But she'd also been deeply committed to Thomas and Elsie, determined to make the best of their circumstances. The final entries, written in the weeks before her death, were especially poignant. The fever won't break. Dr. Morris says I should prepare myself, which is his gentle way of saying I'm dying. I'm not ready. Elsie is so young, and Thomas will close himself off completely. I know him. He'll think he failed me somehow, that he should have saved me. He'll stop letting people in, stop accepting help, stop living anything beyond basic survival. This is what terrifies me most. Not death itself, but what my death will do to the two people I love most in the world. The next entry was dated 2 days before Sarah died. I made Thomas promise today that he'll let people help, that he'll take care of Elsie but also take care of himself, that he'll eventually open his heart again, even though the thought of him with another woman makes me ache with jealousy I have no right to feel. But Elsie needs a mother, and Thomas needs a partner. I cannot condemn them both to loneliness because I'm selfish enough to want them to grieve forever. If someone kind comes into their lives, someone who will love them as fiercely as I have, I hope Thomas will have the courage to let her in. I hope he'll choose life instead of merely existing in the shadow of my death. Lydia closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. Sarah had known, had understood her husband well enough to predict exactly how he'd react to losing her, and had tried to leave him permission to move on. But Thomas hadn't been able to hear it, had broken his promise and retreated exactly as Sarah feared, until Lydia had stumbled into their lives and refused to leave. "What are you doing in here?" Lydia jumped, turning to find Thomas in the doorway. His face was unreadable, but his eyes went immediately to the journal in her hands. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, standing. "I shouldn't have opened her things. I was going to organize them, and I found this, and I'm so sorry." Thomas crossed the room and took the journal from her, staring down at it as if it were something both precious and painful. "I couldn't read it after she died. Couldn't bear to see her words, her handwriting, knowing I'd never hear her voice again." "She knew you," Lydia said softly. "She knew exactly how you'd react to losing her." "Did she?" Thomas flipped through the pages without really looking at them. "Did she know I'd break my promise? That I'd shut everyone out for 8 months? that I'd nearly destroy Elsie in the process. She knew you'd try. She also hoped you'd eventually find your way back. Lydia hesitated, then added, "She wanted you to be happy again, Thomas. She gave you permission to move forward." Thomas's laugh was harsh. Permission. As if I needed permission to betray her memory. Moving forward isn't betrayal. Isn't it? She's been dead less than a year and I'm already… He stopped, jaw clenched. Already what? Lydia pressed gently. Already feeling things I shouldn't feel. Already wanting things I have no right to want. Thomas finally looked at her, and the raw emotion in his eyes made her breath catch. Already waking up thinking about you instead of her, and hating myself for it. Lydia stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Sarah wrote that she hoped someone kind would come into your lives. Someone who would love you both fiercely. Let me be that person, Thomas. Let me love you without you feeling guilty about it. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to love someone new without feeling like I'm erasing what Sarah and I had. You're not erasing anything. Sarah will always be Elsie's mother, always be your first love, always be part of your history, but history doesn't have to be the end of the story. Lydia reached up and touched his face, feeling him tremble under her palm. Let there be a next chapter, please. Thomas closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. I'm afraid, he whispered. Afraid of losing you too. Afraid of loving you and having it ripped away. I don't think I could survive that again. You can't live your life avoiding love because you're afraid of loss. That's not living at all. It's just a slower way of dying. Lydia's thumb stroked his cheek. I'm afraid too. I'm terrified. But I'd rather be terrified and alive than safe and empty. For a long moment, they stood there in Sarah's storage room, surrounded by the remnants of a life ended too soon, and Thomas wrestled with the choice before him. Then slowly, he opened his eyes and looked at Lydia with such intensity she felt it in her bones. I do love you, he said, the words rough and unpracticed. I've been trying not to. Trying to convince myself it's too soon, too wrong, but I do, and it terrifies me. I love you too, Lydia breathed, and it terrifies me too, so let's be terrified together. Thomas pulled her into his arms then, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, his face buried in her hair. She felt his chest heave with emotion he'd been holding back for too long, felt dampness on her neck that might have been tears. They stood like that for several minutes, just holding each other, letting the weight of everything they'd been carrying finally settle into shared burden instead of solitary suffering. When they finally pulled apart, Thomas kept one hand on Lydia's face, his expression wondering. Sarah would have liked you, he said again, but this time it sounded different. Not like an observation, but like a blessing. She would have been glad it was you. A sound from the doorway made them both turn. Elsie stood there in her nightgown, rubbing sleep from her eyes, taking in the scene with a child's uncanny ability to understand what adults try to hide. Are you and Miss Lydia going to get married? She asked with characteristic directness. Thomas and Lydia looked at each other, and Lydia saw her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. It was too soon, wasn't it? Too fast? But then again, what was the point of waiting when they'd both already admitted the truth? Would you want that? Thomas asked his daughter carefully. If Miss Lydia and I got married? Yes! Elsie launched herself at them, and they caught her together, the three of them tumbling into an awkward embrace. Yes, yes, yes! Then she'd really be my mama, and she could never leave, and we'd be a real family. We're already a real family, Lydia said, smoothing Elsie's hair. Marriage doesn't make it more real, but yes, if your father and I decide that's the right path, would you be happy? The happiest, Elsie declared with absolute certainty. Then her face clouded slightly. But what about Mama? My first Mama, will she be sad? Thomas knelt so he was eye level with his daughter, Lydia kneeling beside him. Your Mama loved you more than anything in the world, and she wanted you to be happy, to have people who love you and take care of you. I think she'd be glad that Miss Lydia came into our lives. She wouldn't see it as replacing her. Nothing could ever do that. She'd see it as making sure you have everything you need. Can I have two mamas? Elsie asked, her voice small. One in heaven and one here? Yes, sweetheart, Lydia said, her throat tight with emotion. You can have two mamas who both love you very much." Elsie seemed satisfied with this answer. "Then you should get married soon, before winter comes and the snow makes everything hard." Thomas and Lydia exchanged glances over her head, and Lydia saw a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, giving him permission to speak what they were both thinking. "All right," Thomas said. "We'll get married, soon, before winter." The proposal wasn't romantic in any traditional sense. There was no ring, no prepared speech, no bending knee, but somehow it felt more meaningful than any of those things could have been. A simple agreement between two damaged people to build something together, witnessed by a child who needed them both. The next few weeks were a flurry of preparation. Thomas rode to town to speak with the circuit preacher who came through once a month, arranging for a ceremony. Lydia wrote a letter to her brother, brief and factual, informing him of her plans. She didn't expect a response and didn't receive one, but she felt she owed him at least the information that she was alive and settling into a new life. Mrs. Patterson, when she heard the news, descended on the homestead with several other women in tow, insisting on helping Lydia prepare. They brought fabric for a new dress, taught her how to make a proper wedding cake with the limited ingredients available, and filled the small house with feminine chatter and goodwill that Lydia hadn't realized how much she'd been missing. "I knew it would work out," Mrs. Patterson said smugly, pinning Lydia's hem. "The moment I saw you three together at the social, I knew. You belong together." "Some people don't see it that way," Lydia pointed out, thinking of Martha and her judgmental friends. "Some people wouldn't know love if it bit them on the nose. You pay them no mind." Mrs. Patterson stood back, examining her handiwork. "There. You'll be a beautiful bride, my dear. Thomas is a lucky man." "I think I'm the lucky one," Lydia said quietly. "I came here expecting nothing and found everything." The wedding was set for a Saturday in late September. The morning dawned cool and clear, the first truly comfortable day after months of oppressive heat. Lydia woke in Sarah's room, her room now, truly, and allowed herself a moment of pure terror. She was getting married, to a man she'd known for less than 3 months, to a widower with a traumatized child on a failing homestead in the middle of nowhere. By any rational measure, this was insane, but her heart had stopped listening to rational measures weeks ago. Elsie burst into the room, already dressed in her best clothes, bouncing with excitement. "Miss Lydia, you have to get up. We have so much to do. Mrs. Patterson is coming early to help with your hair, and Papa's already so nervous he burned the breakfast, and everything has to be perfect." Lydia laughed, pulling the child onto the bed for a hug. "It will be perfect because we're all together. That's the only thing that matters. Papa says after today, I should call you Mama instead of Miss Lydia. Is that okay?" The question made Lydia's eyes sting with tears. "It's more than okay, sweetheart. It's perfect." The ceremony itself was simple, held in the church building with perhaps 20 townspeople in attendance. Lydia wore her new dress, pale blue cotton, with simple embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Thomas wore his best suit, slightly threadbare but clean and pressed. Elsie stood between them as they exchanged vows, her small hands clasped in theirs, making it clear that this marriage was a promise to all three of them, not just the adults. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Lydia gently, sweetly, a kiss that held promise of more to come but was appropriate for the audience watching. Elsie squealed and hugged them both, and the assembled crowd applauded with genuine warmth. The celebration afterward was modest, cake and punch, a few toasts, some dancing, but it felt joyful in a way Lydia's Philadelphia life had never been. These people might not have much, but what they had they shared freely. They welcomed her into their community without reservation now that she and Thomas had made things official, and Lydia found herself genuinely touched by their acceptance. As evening approached and guests began drifting away, Mrs. Patterson pulled Lydia aside one last time. "You've made a good choice, my dear. Thomas is a good man, and Elsie is a sweet child. They need you just as much as you need them." "Thank you," Lydia said, "for everything. Your help, your kindness, your acceptance. That's what neighbors do. And you're one of us now, truly. This is your home." Mrs. Patterson kissed her cheek and departed, leaving Lydia standing on the porch, watching the sun set over the prairie. Thomas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Mrs. Crowell," he murmured, "how does it feel?" Strange. Good. Right. Lydia leaned back against him. I keep thinking about that night I stumbled onto your property, half dead from exhaustion, with nowhere else to go. If someone had told me then that I'd end up here, married to you, I would have thought they were crazy. If someone had told me a stranger would save my daughter and my life, I would have said the same. Thomas tightened his arms around her. I'm glad you saw our light that night. Glad you were stubborn enough to stay. Me too. Lydia turned in his embrace, looking up at him. I love you, Thomas Crowell, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving that coming here was the best decision I ever made. I love you too, more than I thought I could love again. He kissed her forehead, her nose, finally her lips. Thank you for choosing us, for choosing this life. Where else would I be? Lydia smiled. This is home. Inside they found Elsie had fallen asleep in her clothes on the sofa, exhausted from the excitement of the day. Thomas carried her to bed while Lydia changed into her nightgown, and when he returned to their room now, no longer just his or just Sarah's, but something new and shared, he found her sitting on the edge of the bed, looking nervous. Are you all right? He asked gently. Yes, just thinking about how much has changed, how different this all is from what I expected my life to be. Thomas sat beside her, taking her hand. Do you regret it? Not for a second, but I am a little scared of what comes next. Winter, you said, is brutal here, and we're barely scraping by as it is. What if I can't handle it? What if I fail you both? Then we'll fail together, and we'll pick ourselves up and try again. Thomas lifted her hand to his lips. I'm not promising you an easy life, Lydia. I can't. But I can promise that whatever comes, we'll face it together, all three of us. That's worth more than easy. Yes, Lydia agreed softly. It is. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the homestead settling around them, Lydia felt a peace she'd never known before. It wasn't the absence of fear or uncertainty. Those still existed, hovering at the edges of her consciousness. It was the presence of belonging, of knowing that she had a place and people who needed her as much as she needed them. The months that followed brought challenges, just as Thomas had warned. Winter descended with fierce cold that made the summers seem merciful by comparison. They huddled close to the fire, rationing their fuel, making every resource stretch further than seemed possible. There were days when Lydia's hands were so cold she could barely feel them, when the wind howled so loudly conversation was impossible, when she wondered if spring would ever come. But there were also moments of profound beauty, mornings when the snow transformed the harsh prairie into something ethereal and magical. Evenings gathered around the fire, Elsie tucked between her parents, listening to stories or working on lessons. The three of them learning to move together like a single organism, anticipating each other's needs, sharing work and worry and small joys. Elsie thrived, growing taller and more confident with each passing week. She called Lydia Mama, now without hesitation, though occasionally she would add, my second mama, as if to clarify that she hadn't forgotten her first. Her drawings evolved to show a house under sunshine, three figures always together, always smiling. Thomas softened in ways Lydia had never expected. The hard edges worn by grief gradually smoothed, and while he never forgot Sarah, kept her photograph on the mantel, spoke of her to Elsie with love and respect. He stopped living in the past. He laughed more, smiled more easily, reached for Lydia's hand without conscious thought. One evening in late winter, as they sat together after Elsie had gone to bed, Thomas took Lydia's hand and placed it on her own belly. Do you feel different? He asked quietly. Lydia had been wondering the same thing for weeks, but had been afraid to hope. I think so. Maybe. Mrs. Patterson stopped by while you were in town last week. Said she'd been a midwife before coming to Nevada. Said if we needed her services in the summer, she'd be honored to help. Thomas's eyes searched Lydia's face. I think she knows something we haven't confirmed yet. Would you be happy? If there was a baby? Lydia asked, suddenly nervous. It was one thing to accept a ready-made family, another to expand it. I'd be terrified, Thomas admitted. After what happened with Sarah, the thought of you going through childbirth scares me more than I can say. But yes, I'd be happy. Another piece of our life together, Another reason to build something that lasts. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Lydia's suspicions were confirmed. By the time the wildflowers bloomed across the prairie, she was noticeably pregnant, and Elsie was beside herself with excitement about becoming a big sister. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" Elsie asked constantly. "We won't know until the baby arrives," Lydia would answer, rubbing her expanding belly. "But either way, they'll be lucky to have you as a sister." Thomas was simultaneously excited and terrified, hovering over Lydia with concern that would have been suffocating if it weren't so clearly born of love. He insisted she rest more, take on less physical work, let him handle things she'd previously managed. Lydia alternated between being touched and being exasperated. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she reminded him when he tried to carry her across a puddle. "I know, but I already lost one wife. I'm not taking chances with another." The words were light, but his eyes held real fear. Summer arrived with its customary heat, and Lydia discovered that being heavily pregnant in the Nevada summer was its own special kind of torture. But Mrs. Patterson and several other women from town visited regularly, bringing advice and supplies, making sure Lydia had everything she needed. The community that had once been suspicious of her now embraced her fully as one of their own. In August, on a night when the heat was finally beginning to break, Lydia went into labor. Thomas sent Elsie to stay with Mrs. Patterson while he paced the house like a caged animal, useless and terrified. The midwife, calm and competent, shooed him outside. "Let us women work. You'll only be in the way with all that nervous energy." The hours that followed were the longest of Thomas's life. He sat on the porch, listening to sounds from inside that made his heart stop, remembering another night, another woman, another ending that had destroyed him. He prayed to a higher power he wasn't sure he believed in anymore, bargained with the universe, promised anything if only Lydia and the baby would survive. Dawn was just breaking when he heard it, the sharp, indignant cry of a newborn. Thomas was on his feet instantly, but Mrs. Patterson appeared before he could rush inside. "You have a son," she announced with a tired smile. "A healthy, loud son. And your wife is fine. Exhausted, but fine. Give us a few minutes to clean up, then you can come see them." The relief was so overwhelming Thomas had to sit back down, his legs suddenly unable to hold him. A son. Lydia was fine. They were both fine. The fear he'd been carrying for months finally released its grip on his chest. When he was finally allowed inside, he found Lydia propped up in bed, pale and exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in cloth. She looked up as he approached, and her smile widened. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Thomas sat carefully on the edge of the bed, looking down at the small, scrunched face peeking from the blanket. The baby was red and wrinkled and absolutely perfect. "He's beautiful," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "You're both beautiful." "His name is Samuel," Lydia said. "Samuel Thomas Crowell, after my father and you. If that's all right?" "It's perfect." Thomas touched the baby's tiny fist, marveling when small fingers wrapped around his large one. "Thank you for surviving, for giving me this, for everything." "We're a family," Lydia said simply. "That's what families do. They survive together, they build together, they love together." When Elsie was brought home later that morning, she was so excited she could barely contain herself. She climbed carefully onto the bed, peering at her new brother with wonder. "He's so small," she breathed. "Was I ever that small?" "Even smaller," Thomas assured her. "You were born a month early and scared me half to death." "Can I hold him?" With careful supervision, Elsie held Samuel, her face a picture of concentration and love. "Hi, Samuel," she whispered. "I'm your big sister, Elsie. I'm going to teach you everything I know, and I'm going to protect you forever. That's what big sisters do." Watching his family, his whole family, gathered on the bed together, Thomas felt something settle in his chest that he thought was broken beyond repair. This was healing, he realized. Not forgetting, not replacing, but growing around the wound until it became part of the landscape rather than the defining feature. Sarah would always be part of their story, always be remembered and honored. But the story wasn't over. It had simply taken an unexpected turn, one that led to this moment, this family, this life. That evening, After Mrs. Patterson had left and the baby was sleeping, Thomas sat in the rocking chair with Elsie on his lap while Lydia rested. His daughter was quiet, thoughtful, her fingers playing with the buttons on his shirt. "Papa?" she said finally. "Are we happy now?" "Yes, sweetheart. I think we are." "Good. Because Mama, my first Mama, I think she'd be happy that we're happy. I don't think she wanted us to be sad forever." "No," Thomas agreed, his throat tight. "She didn't want that at all. She wanted exactly this, for us to find joy again, to build a new family, to keep living. I'm glad Mama Lydia, I'm glad she didn't leave that day when she almost went back to Philadelphia." Elsie looked up at him with her dark, serious eyes. "If she'd left, we'd still be alone and sad. But she stayed, and now we have baby Samuel, and we're a real family again." "We were always a real family," Thomas corrected gently. "But yes, I'm glad she stayed too. It was the bravest thing she could have done." As autumn arrived and the heat finally broke completely, the Crowell family settled into their new normal. Samuel grew and thrived. Elsie started lessons in town with other children her age, and Thomas managed to secure steady work with a ranch nearby, bringing in income that made their survival less precarious. Lydia, recovered from childbirth, threw herself back into managing the household, now with the added complexity of a baby's needs. The homestead that had seemed so desolate and lonely when Lydia first stumbled onto it was now filled with life and laughter. Laundry flapped on the line, so much laundry with a baby in the house. The vegetable garden Lydia had nursed back to health provided fresh produce. The sound of Elsie's voice raised in song while she did her chores drifted through open windows. One evening in late October, with winter's approach making the air crisp and clean, the whole family sat on the porch together. Thomas held Samuel while Elsie sat on Lydia's lap, and they watched the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. "Tell the story again," Elsie requested, "about how Mama Lydia came here." It had become one of her favorite stories, the tale of how their family had been formed. Lydia smiled and began the familiar narrative. "Once upon a time, there was a woman who was lost. She'd traveled a very long way, expecting to find one thing, but instead she found something else entirely. She found a little girl who needed someone to love her, and a man who'd forgotten how to hope, and a home that needed filling with life again." "And she almost left," Elsie prompted. "Yes, she almost left. She was scared, and thought she should go back to where she came from, but a very brave little girl stopped her and asked her to stay. And even though staying seemed impossible and frightening, the woman decided to be brave too. She decided to choose love instead of safety, family instead of security. And they all lived happily ever after," Elsie finished with satisfaction. "Not quite," Lydia corrected gently. "They all lived. That's the most important part. Sometimes happily, sometimes not so happily, but always together, always as a family." Thomas reached over and took Lydia's free hand, squeezing it gently. No words were necessary. Everything that needed to be said lived in that simple touch, in the way they'd learned to communicate in glances and small gestures, in the life they'd built from broken pieces and desperate hope. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, they remained on the porch, reluctant to go inside and end the perfect moment. The prairie stretched around them, vast and endless, but it no longer felt isolating. It felt like possibility, like freedom, like home. Elsie fell asleep first, her head heavy on Lydia's shoulder. Thomas stood and carefully gathered her in his arms, carrying her inside to bed. When he returned, he took Samuel from Lydia, the baby also sleeping soundly, and disappeared to put him in his cradle. Lydia remained on the porch, rocking slowly, breathing in the cool night air. Thomas came back one more time, sitting beside her and pulling her against his side. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly. "About how strange life is. How one moment can change everything. If I'd waited another day to leave Philadelphia, I might have missed Patterson's train. If I'd turned back instead of following your light that first night. If you'd refused to let me stay, or if I'd gone back to Philadelphia when I had the chance. So many moments where things could have gone differently. But they didn't. You're here. We're here. That's what matters." "Yes," Lydia agreed softly. "That's what matters." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, and Lydia thought about the journey that had brought her here. From Philadelphia to Nevada, from scandal to redemption, from loneliness to belonging. It hadn't been the path she'd planned or expected. It had been harder, stranger, more frightening than anything she'd imagined. But it had also been better. Better than safety, better than security, better than any carefully constructed life she could have built on her own. She'd come to Nevada expecting a husband and found a family instead. She'd expected comfort and found purpose. She'd expected an ending and found a beginning. And on a remote homestead at the edge of nowhere, surrounded by prairie and sky and the people she'd chosen to love, Lydia Hale Crowell finally understood what home really meant. Not a place, not a building, not even a town or a territory. Home was wherever the people you loved were gathered, wherever hearts beat in rhythm, wherever someone held your hand and promised that whatever came next, you'd face it together. The night deepened around them, but inside the small house, light glowed warm and steady. A lantern in the window, visible for miles across the dark prairie. Not a beacon for lost travelers anymore, but a symbol of something found, something built, something that would endure. Inside, 2 children slept peacefully. Outside, 2 adults sat together, no longer alone, no longer afraid. And somewhere in the vast Nevada sky, perhaps Sarah looked down and smiled, seeing the life she'd hoped for her family, the healing she'd wished for Thomas, the love she'd known Elsie deserved. The story that had begun with departure ended with arrival. The woman who'd tried to leave quietly had learned instead how to stay loudly, fully, with her whole heart. And the little girl who'd whispered, "Please don't let us be alone again," would never have to whisper those words again. They were home, all of them, together, and that was enough.